Hey everybody, I'm Jason and I'm here with Leo and Alison McDowell. We wanted to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's going on with Protocol Labs and well, we have a bunch of stuff, the Santa Fe Institute, but really basically about tokenization and public goods. And Alison has been so kind to put together some maps, more maps. We gotta love the maps. So yeah, that's kind of what we want to do. We just wanted to kind of have an informal conversation. We've got a few clips that we've set aside, and yeah, a lot of people still don't get what it is we're talking about here. And I think it's because the conversation and the narrative and even the critique is already had been prepackaged and delivered for us to consume and then discuss about it. But the framing of it is off. And so Alison was telling me, like, somebody was asking her about, like, so what's wrong with decentralization? And that question itself is the wrong question, because it's not really about decentralization versus centralization. That's not really what we're dealing with here. And I was saying, like, well, actually, this in a way, the system that's being set up is centralized in a very extreme way in terms of the protocols and the rules that are going to govern it. Just the management of it and the distribution of it is distributed and decentralized, but it's also centralized. So that's not the right question.
Well,
but yeah.
So essentially, Jason forwarded me sort of a relatively short, maybe 25-minute introduction about Protocol Labs. And that's something that we've been, paying attention to for some time, some of us longer than others, but it's central to the sort of the Web3 smart contract layer, this idea of having an operating system for global society, I guess. And so in listening to it, I thought, wow, well, there's a lot of key points that I think if we can pull segments and then talk about them in more detail, it might give people a better handle on what's actually happening. Because I increasingly feel like the conversations around Web3 being centered around crypto specifically, or like the financial side, are obscuring the true nature of tokenization and what the tokens are meant to do. Not only, which has some measure of financial control and social control embedded in the financial control, but it's a lot bigger, and it's about how we relate to one another in society and how we relate to the built environment. So they talk about, like, socio-technical and cyber-physical systems, like how we actually move about the world is more like what you've said in the past, Jason, around like freedom tokens, right? So it's money, and for now it looks like money how we've traditionally kind of understood it. But in the future, these tokens are going to get a lot more creative in terms of their applications in this global operating system. And so I wanted to maybe open up a little bit just with your, Leo, like you and Jason, like your perspectives on what you know of the space broadly, and then how it's represented in the narratives, even within the alt narratives space, in terms of guiding the conversation into some areas and out away from others. Because I think what's been happening in the crypto space the last couple weeks, even people that I'm friendly with who never talk about crypto at all, or it's like sending me things, and so it's clearly there's some resonance there. They're trying to get traction for certain narratives, and I think, as with all of this narrative building, there's a reason behind it. So I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts of, like, not in detail the past few weeks, but just how the narratives are being crafted based on the larger picture as you understand it?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, and I don't know, like, I haven't really looked into too much about everything that happened, but what I'm seeing is a lot of stories about, like, crypto companies acting in the same way that, like, Wall Street financiers, like, irresponsible people act, and that they need to be, like, brought into the whole the same sort of regulations and rules that like regulated institutions are a part of. So that's definitely like the main thing that I've seen, and it really has like, and some of them even say it too. Like I think I was reading on Wall Street, like a Washington Post article, and they're like, "Oh, it's not even about crypto, this whole thing," which is kind of true because I mean, it's about like a company really. It's not really about like crypto. And then with this whole conversation, it's of course like not actually talking about the implications of a world where blockchain and interoperable data are the foundation for like social interaction and good and like the economy and taking care of each other and healthcare and like everything else and education and whatnot. Right. So it's just obviously they don't talk about any of that actual implications.
In the background of like COP27. I was just going to say, like, against the backdrop of the COP27 sustainability narratives, like it would be a logical thing to talk about more broadly the Web3 intersection with the finance, but that I don't see that story coming out so much.
Definitely not.
Well, I think most people don't really understand what cybernetics is. And I think without that, you can't understand what this thing is unless you understand how this is. I mean, people have heard the term social engineering or whatever, but even that a lot of time is framed in either a left-right sort of paradigm, but not seeing it as like as a whole, as polarity, as like both things and all things are can be incorporated into this system of control. And yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. And money in many ways has been that already. You know, you can shape and steer the direction of society through the issuance of credit and through the issuance of money, debt. But this is like taking it to a whole nother level, you know, but seeing it as a system that actually they're addressing real problems and real values to a large extent. And so that's why there's an appeal toward it. Like, yeah, we do need to do something about this. Oh yeah, we need to do something about that. But seeing that the decisions, you know, the real decision-making power is in the system itself. Like it's not value neutral. It already like has a predetermined path. And, you know,
can you describe cybernetics for people just in a few words? Like, how would you?
That would be a good.
Put you on the spot.
Yeah, I need to look up the actual definition, but it's like, it's using all, you know, it's taking all this information in and then creating mechanisms by which you can steer society towards this direction or that society. So like. The word Kubernetes comes to mind, which is like, you know, comes from like a steering wheel or an oar. We've talked about that. You know, I need to actually like
a pathway
come up with
a certain optimization outcome.
Optimization. Yeah, exactly.
I thought like cybernetics was basically just the science of control. And regulation and feedback loops and both mechanical and the way mechanical systems interface with more unpredictable things like society or whatever. But yeah, I thought like just in like the fewest words, the science of control, but I don't know if that's totally.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that there's variations. Like you can veer off the path, and then there's a force that will guide you back onto the path. And so there is some play involved. It's not like cybernetics is dynamic in that you're not just stuck right on the path doing exactly the thing all the time. There is some movement but it's within limits. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's important to understand just as we sort of navigate the storytelling is that there is some play involved. There is some flexibility because
there's a free dome.
There's a free dome. Yeah, exactly. Like you like if the dome were on either side of the path, at some point you can't go beyond the boundary. You're going to get tucked back in. And yeah, and then the looping, remembering the past behavior and applying the lessons from the past behavior to current and future behavior and predictions about that.
What's funny,
I looked it up. the Google definition real quick, and it's the science of communications and automatic control systems in both machines and living things. Yeah. So it's like creating the whole schematic of the processes of all things, pretty much. So, you know.
Technical, cyber physical, those both, right? Yeah. Like automated.
Well, cybernetics wasn't a new word for me. I just didn't actually know what it meant, because I'd heard cybernetics and science fiction and all of that, and I actually I equated it to cyborgs. So like, when I did cybernetics, I just, in my mind, I would have, 5 years ago or well, more like 2 years ago, if somebody said take a guess on what cybernetics means, I would have said like, oh, it's like cyborg technology or something, which in a way it kind of is, but it's more than just your actual body. It's public goods.
An energy flow, and that's why oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna. It's a mathematical description of all things and how to change or influence them, and energy and resources and all that stuff.
Can I read something real quick? I just started this book last night, Technopoly. It's by Neil Postman. It's an outdated book. It's not outdated actually, but it's not up to date in terms of the actual technology. But the idea is a lot of it's more philosophical. So it's really useful. I just started it, but Neil Postman wrote, he was a critic of technology, and his most famous book, I think, is "Amusing Ourselves to Death" and what television is doing to our brains. This is in the 80s, which is a great book, actually. I highly recommend it. But I read this. I thought it might be kind of an interesting beginning, and I know Alison has done a lot on you came into this through the education space and testing and all of that. And so the first instance of grading students' papers occurred at Cambridge University in 1792 at the suggestion of a tutor named William Farish. No one knows much about William Farish. Not more than a handful have ever even heard of him. And yet his idea that a quantitative value should be assigned to a human thought was a major step forward constructing a mathematical concept of reality. If a number can be given to the quality of thought, then a number can be given to the qualities of mercy, love, hate, beauty, creativity, intelligence, and even sanity itself. When Galileo said that the language of nature is written in mathematics, he did not mean to include human feeling or accomplishments or an insight. But most of us are now inclined to make these inclusions. Our psychologists, sociologists, and educators find it quite impossible to do their work without numbers. They believe that without numbers, they cannot acquire or express authentic knowledge. Anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting thing because I think it plays into this. It's like it's stripping everything down to a number, a calculation, and like in a larger sense, that's kind of what we're dealing with here. So, anyways, I thought I would just share that.
Yeah, that was I appreciate that. It does capture like what Web3 is about, I feel like, in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And pay for success. I mean, ultimately, they are going to start grading behavior change. I mean, that's what the behavioral economics is, to make behaviors computable and then track them in the outside-in robot.
Yeah, and it's the same with the ecosystem services stuff and all the environmental credits around, because it's about getting people to like do cover crops or manure injections or different like practices. So like they're trying to get behavior changes in a certain way that has been demonstrated to show a specific impact on water quality or soil, organic matter or whatnot. So yeah.
Well, do you guys want to watch some clips?
Some clips, sure.
I thought, well, I kind of was going through. It seemed like we would start here with the protocol labs. This middle one here, is that?
I'm not sure. Is there a clip actually on that one? I might have just had that.
Oh yeah. No, that's just the. I
think I started off at the top. Yeah, the picture.
We should probably introduce Because I don't think we've
Yeah,
said
what is
what
protocol? Yeah, people don't. Yeah, we need to set up.
People don't.
Yeah, jump right in.
Yeah, I don't know a ton about them, but they're like a software company that's built several different things, but currently are building what's called Filecoin protocol, which is it's a blockchain for creating an economic protocol for storing, for like storage, for computer storage. And it's built on top of IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, which is it's not a blockchain thing, but it's basically like a open protocol that is on the internet that you can for file storage, basically. So what Filecoin is sort of an economic layer on top of IPFS to create the economic incentives that file can be stored for periods of times. Because there's all sorts of this has sort of been like a thing in crypto for a long time that projects have tried to do that hasn't worked out very well, because there's sort of weird economic issue, like crypto, like weird economic issues for making a like decentralized like cloud storage layer. So that's what they're trying to do, pretty much.
So like to do the big data analytics, they need to have access to immense amount of data over time. Is that what you're saying? And like who's going to store it and how is it maintained?
Yeah, it's pretty much just like cloud storage, but on a blockchain, I guess would be the simplest way to think about it. And
would it be a competitor to Ocean Protocol, or is it a similar thing? Or
no, I don't think so. It'd be more for like for Google Drive. Like that's what they would want to be like a competitor to, is somewhere where you can store really large amounts of data, but not. Ocean Protocol is more like a marketplace for data for AI, where this is simply just to store it and to pay like providers to store the data for a certain amount of time.
What I'm a little confused about too, though, is just like they're doing that, but they're also, if you look at some of the videos that they're putting out, there's also a lot of discussion about like brain technology in terms of connecting like your brain, your neural brain network with the actual network, which is very with the protocol network. So it's
I don't know so much, because they seem to be doing a lot of different stuff, and I don't know a ton about it. I mean
I haven't quite fully figured it out, because it's clear, like, their central thing or their public thing is doing the Filecoin, but there's also some other things that don't seem like they seem out of place, but maybe they're not.
Well, and before we get totally into it, Leo, do you think you could say a few things about like refi, like versus DeFi, like regenerative finance versus decentralized finance? Because I think if people aren't familiar with that as a structure, it might be confusing as to what these people are up to. Because all of this is being framed as sort of a public benefit, like data advancing some elements of environmental or public outcomes that are good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's this term called refi that sort of came about playing off of DeFi, decentralized finance, called regenerative finance, and it's basically like a subsector of the Web3 space. But I mean, not really just them too, because obviously they're getting funding involved and inspiration from all these like well-established people that have been doing this stuff since the 60s or whatever. But about creating they're all about creating essentially financial protocols for some sort of like positive impact on society or something, thinking that they can create like engineered systems for social organization and have them use blockchain financial tools in order to empower whatever it is that they want to do for their community or whatnot. So the ones that we've like studied the most probably is the IXO Foundation, and they're a blockchain built on Cosmos, and their whole thing is creating what are called impact verifiers. So creating the cryptographic and economic systems for funding projects based on their success in doing certain predefined goals. Like a big one is in their big project with UBS Bank in India on education is an impact bond where their goals were to have certain changes in the children's like educational outcomes, like having certain tests, achieving certain test scores for reading or, math and whatnot. And then so the payout is based on those test scores, but it's all automated. So the tests are all on computers or tablets or whatnot. And then as the kids go through the programs and take the tests, those results automatically trigger the payouts for the bonds or not trigger them if they don't meet the metrics or whatnot. And that's essentially what they did, is creating the cryptographic system. And there's sort of complicated economics for the bond itself and tokenizing that bond that there's sort of a lot to go into at once, but that's like what they do. And yeah, Dr. Sean Conway has been in the like development finance space for a long time, like pretty high up in the WHO and working for the British Foreign Development Office and all these things. But
their hands are in everything because he was part of that Hong Kong Time Bank, conversation. Yep. And so there's the equal parts of the environmental benefits, which I think you like, soil, water, air quality, which you've been looking at more. And then there's the human capital part that it's sort of more my jurisdiction. And I think what I've seen, this is the pay for success finance, these deal flows that are going to be, whether it's called social impact bonds or outcome-based payments or what have you, they come up with different names to try to provide cover for it. But it's some sort of an outcome, which the outcome in and of itself is part of the cybernetics. You have to define the outcome to steer towards it. And so, I think regenerative also to me feels a lot like the circular economy. The circular economy meaning like a circuit, or the cybernetic, like the feedback loop, that this big push towards regenerative finances, that it balances out somehow. But I think what they're moving towards is to try to bring these to scale. And I'm not sure in the environmental space, but the human capital space, they have all these pilots for 15 years. They haven't quite brought them on board to scale in a fully automated way that might be done through one of these data clearinghouses. And so it's hard to say how far out before we actually get to that. But at the baseline, they need everyone to have a digital identity, and they need to have the parameters set. So I feel like that's the phase we're in now.
Yeah, I was just trying to think about like the obstacle of people like really wrapping their mind around it. And I was just like thinking, imagine like automated governance run by private corporations. It's like, because like it's like the role of government is like kind of shifting radically, and they openly say, like everyone from Peter Thiel to a lot of these people openly say like, yeah, we want to subvert government. Now, I'm not defending government because I have like major problems with the government, but I'm just saying the thing that they're wanting to replace it with is actually in many ways worse.
Well, and it might not even be corporations. It may be investment portfolio run by computers.
Right. Like but even those are still like
run by computers. So
but they'll be like they'll still be like DAO corporations. They'll still there'll be some sort of like entity of some sort, like not legal fiction. However they map that out.
Well, I will just say too, the thing that I've, in all of these things, you get bits of information and you don't fully appreciate the significance of them until maybe 3 years later. And then you're like, oh, that's what that was about, right? Like, that's where this fits in. And so one of these deal structures that I've been familiar with for some time is called an impact security. And it was advanced by this organization called NPX, N as in Nancy, P as in Paul, X as in xylophone, NPX, Impact Security. And that deal flow for Pay for Success didn't involve the government at all. And so it was like a public-private partnership where all of a sudden the government, the public has just like disappeared, like in this new brave new world future. And it's just literally, you have investors investing in outcomes. And if the targets are hit, they're paid back by philanthropy. Now, when I first saw this, I was thinking like, this is Hewlett-Packard investing in pre-K where the children are tracked on Hewlett-Packard devices and wearables that when they hit the metric, they're paid back by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. So I was picturing all of these like Gates and Microsoft and the Gates Foundation, or the Dell and the Dell Foundation. Like, you could have all of these things where essentially the people are trapped in the middle, whether they're pre-K or veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder VR headsets or something, as like the washing machine for the money to just spin around and make more money for these entities through their philanthropy. But I didn't really understand the tokenization or staking or DAOs or Bancor or these automated protocols at that point, and that we could be getting pretty close to having these deals happening totally outside of elected government pretty soon. Like, for me, I figured it would be maybe within 10 to 15 years, we bankrupt all the governments because these entities are not paying any taxes. And then essentially the government just becomes AI. But it doesn't even feel that far off anymore. Like, you could have these parallel systems running like within the smart contract layer in pretty short order if we can make it acceptable. So yeah, I was having, like, one of the founders of NPX is out of Wharton too. So, I've always had that sitting around, like, what is that about? But as I start to understand, like, the staking a little better, like, you can start to make money by, like, not even putting much at risk. They just but it's all a fiction, Jason. Like, it's like what you say, it's all about telling stories about money. Like, what is actually real and what is actually true versus just, it's a mathematical model of something about money.
Yeah. Well, we have some clips here, and then we can maybe just start working through them.
Do you want to do the brain one first? Because that's the one that's unrelated. The brain one, the neurotech one, was part of a different.
Okay, let's see. Which one is this?
The yellow one. It's
on the top left of the yellow.
Oh, neurotech. Gotcha.
Yeah, and I'll just say the irony of this is I'm watching this, and then I call Jason and we're talking. And he's like, I was just watching that same video. So this was from a different clip, but it was maybe 2 weeks earlier, and we happened to literally be watching it at the same time, like unknowingly to each other.
Yeah, that was kind of weird because there's a lot of videos. I mean, just Protocol Labs or Ethereum Foundation alone, they'll have, like, they just did this DevCon, and there's there's well over 100 presentations on that one. I think I didn't count them, but there's a lot. Yeah, so these guys, all right, here we go. Let me know if you guys.
So Juan Panay is with Protocol Labs, and this guy next to him with the red backdrop is Adam Marblestone. And in it, I thought it was kind of interesting. He said, like, oh, we've known each other for 10 years. Now, I'm not great with ages, but, like, maybe they're in their early 40s. Like, to know somebody for 10 years in the space, that seems like a long time, given the overall time frame, like, that this relationship goes back a ways.
To convey this a little bit, I can speculate even a little bit more than Millen was willing to, and sort of where I think it's likely that, like, long term this looks like. And some of that is inspired by, although it's not identical, the case for how you do human interfacing. It's not identical to the question that we asked in the 2013 paper, which was about how do you do sort of complete coverage of the mouse brain activity. But it's related, right? Because basically the big problem with the mouse brain is this 3-dimensional centimeter or so thick object. And you have to basically interrogate that object even though it's opaque, without heating it up, without destroying that object, right? It's a sort of real-time sensing of a three-dimensional light sensitive and heat sensitive hunk of material. And the human brain problem is somewhat related. The skull is a slightly different thing than the tissue, but basically that's this constraint of sort of three-dimensional sensing of an opaque biological object. That's basically the question. You're using kind of non-invasive forms of radiation, so light, sound, magnetic fields that can penetrate through tissue. And light doesn't exactly penetrate because it bounces around and scatters, but it can actually go quite a long distance. So light, sound, and other types of non-invasive things like magnetics in combination with each other. Neurons naturally aren't coupling to those modalities incredibly well. So then you need to add in a kind of transducer, and DARPA in a fairly recent program called as a nanotransducer, and that is the thing that couples the neurons to that form of radiation, so that it can talk to them, right? Like optogenetics as an example. So I think there are kind of these couple of big areas that you would push, where at the beginning you don't directly make that BCI system that has all of those things together. This is kind of the technological road mapping part, is that you might need to make big technical pushes on some of the components. How do you deliver the radiation? How do you steer the radiation in this like scattering material? And then also how do you deliver these nanotransducers, which could be done with viruses, it could be done with nanoparticles, it could be something else, but sort of gene or cell therapy, gene or cell delivery to the brain. Initially the non-invasive modality that you would use for some medical application without the nanotransducer might be kind of a big clunky MRI-like thing. It's not a portable consumer product that Facebook immediately wants to put in its AR glasses. It's going to use a lot of power and stuff. But then if you added the nanotransducer later, then that would make it much easier to couple to that detailed information. And so the nanotransducer makes it easier rather than harder to get the information. But then there's this other path, right? You can't do that all necessarily in one company or one effort. And so that's why I think that there's these kind of FRO-like kind of moonshotty projects on these kind of non-invasive radiation, and then fundamental biological kind of delivery and access with things like genes and cells, not to mention the connectomics and the brain mapping and understanding how do you target those genes and cells to circuits. Each of those things to some degree has applications on their own. And so one of the ones that I think is most exciting, where there is a real application, is one that Millen just mentioned kind of in passing, which is ultrasound. And so ultrasound, there's a group out of Caltech that's really pushing it, and a few other groups. But ultrasound, several key things about it. One is that you can create it and detect it using tiny microchips, right? These are micro electromechanical systems. You can make a chip that can vibrate ultrasound. It doesn't have to be a big device. You can have sort of very miniaturized delivery and sensing of the ultrasound on a chip. Two, ultrasound can naturally both stimulate the brain and do things like this blood-brain barrier opening without any genes or cells having to be part of the picture that are exogenous. And it can also see brain activity in a way that's probably better than many of the things we're talking about, like near-infrared spectroscopy or fMRI. And so the question is basically, how do you make an ultrasound platform for the brain today? And the problem there is that sending ultrasound through the skull is difficult. You can do it, but it requires you to have a pretty long wavelength of ultrasound, which means your spatial precision is low. And so if you can instead put the ultrasound emitter detector array, this chip, above the brain, so not touching the brain, which is really good for safety, but inside the skull, then that would be, just from a fundamental technology platform perspective, that would be how you could use ultrasound to sort of see the whole brain at kind of intermediate resolution. And eventually you'll have things like ultrasound sensitive proteins and stuff like that or cells that would be the full interface. But that's really powerful even now. But that's another example where, it has certain applications, epilepsy and some others, that are very immediate. But if you want to try to say, well, how are we going to solve depression or OCD with that? You actually kind of need the thing to be in the brain for a while and do some scientific studies to understand how those things work before you can say, here's a sure shot at the exact way we have to use ultrasound to stimulate that. So it's still a discovery platform kind of play, which again is not the traditional kind of product market market fit orientation, where medical device companies basically require you to have product market fit before you start the company, essentially. So,
well, I'm just really inspired by the fact that DARPA is so concerned about mental health that they're willing to put. Yeah, and the use of the word therapy, and it's selling this as we're here to help people. That's what we know what their main concern is. Alison, Leo.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not really kind of like what. It's a bit unrelated to all the other stuff. I mean, it's just crazy that they could remotely convince themselves that this is like healthcare or resembles healthcare, like taking care of people. Like,
well, and there's no doubt that it'll be used for that. There'll be cases where they use it for that, but the overall thing that's to just ignore the dual use, which I would say that the primary purpose of it is not for healthcare.
Oh yeah. No, it's just that they can even like talk about it in that way when it's just such a engineer. Like it's just like beams of light. Like if you're talking about health, like it's like, okay, like where it's just such. I don't know. It just feels like so far off what conversations around like healing,
right?
But
well, and I'm not saying like to share this to be like panic, like this is going to happen in the next couple years. Like even they're saying it's going to be a ways, like first you refine, it's an interesting how they represent like the compartmentalization, right? They're like, okay, some people over here are making the thing to deliver the ultrasound or the light waves, and then they're separate from the people making the chips because they need to keep them apart, right? They need to tell the chip people that they're solving epilepsy, and they need to tell the other people they're doing a diagnostic, and they're not going to say, by the way, like our imagining is in 20 years, these things are all going to come together to have a cloud mind on blockchain that like with minimal interface. It's the plausible deniability and the dual use conversation. But once you know that, that's clearly, they're talking about how they will structure it to allow it to all to go forward. But towards the end, then the question is, how do you finance it? Because what he's saying is like, it doesn't fit a traditional medical device model. And for me, what I'm imagining is that at some future element, like later on, they talk about operating systems being like superpowers, right? And so are they going to direct the narrative so that within the time frame of them delivering this device, this becomes a digital human right? Like it's the closing the digital divide conversation, right? Like everyone needs broadband, everyone needs high speed fiber, everybody needs the cheap device, everybody needs a phone. How can you deprive the global south or poor people of this technology? By the time they get the stuff together, the new finance model, I think, will be that this is a public good and should be like free or universal acquisition of this high level technology of brain machine interface is undoubtedly a public good. I think that's how it will be steered. And therefore we will create some tokenized system that through your UBI, like you pay off in small increments, like through your, renting your brain waves back into the kitty so that the next person can get the free installation. So, I mean, that's what I'm seeing when I'm listening to this part of it, is that like, how does the R&D move forward with plausible deniability? How is the finance stuff working? How is the built environment being set up to deliver light and frequency, right? All of these small cell, like why does 5G need to be every 500 feet? Well, because at some point it's going to shift that is the delivery device for the like cloud mined infrastructure, right? Whether it's that exact sensor technology that we have today, or whether it's normalized that of course we have poles everywhere holding these devices, and then that one just gets swapped out for the newer version that can deliver your optogenetic photonic light transmission. I feel like it's just this very slow boil, but they know, like, I mean, the way they're talking about it, they clearly know that that's the plan. And so if you imagine that the more productive conversation in my mind than talking about the corruption of the crypto space or people who are doing dirty deals in that space is, should we be installing a global digital contract layer for society, and how does it interface with this idea that you may be hooked up in a very direct way your consciousness into the cloud? And
Right.
what does that look like, folks? Because that's what we're leaving the next generation, like behind us, who don't have a say yet. They have no clue. And that's, if we were being responsible, I feel like all of the people who are these influencers in the crypto space, you know, and asserting like, you know, these other storylines, like, you know, maybe we can put down the Jeffrey Epstein books for a minute and talk about this stuff, right? Like, because to me, the role of the Santa Fe Institute and the consciousness and the complexity and how this is all working together is probably going to be more important in the long run than some particular individual at a particular time with the sort of, you know, voyeuristic storyline that wants to draw you in. Anyway.
Right. Well, and I would say that, you know, the things like the Jeffrey Epstein thing are important. It's just, if that's all you're talking about for years, and you're not talking about this, it's a real problem. And it's interesting too, because like Protocol Labs, again, it's a cloud thing. It's a file coin. You know, here they are talking about, you know, ultrasound neurotech and transducers. So, you know, connect the dots.
Right.
You know, yeah, pretty wild. So the next one, introduction.
Well, say,
oh, go ahead.
Can I say one more thing? So,
Yeah.
And I think this builds off of the series we did previously about sort of the atomic ecologies and, you know, the Cold War morphing from the Manhattan Project into the Human Genome Project, and this idea of physics, biophysics, and now also econophysics, like the economy, like energy economies and energy economies connected to biology, because that's very much what the Santa Fe Institute has been about since the 80s when it was set up, was bringing in the economics into the biophysics space. And many of those people came directly out of Los Alamos in terms of high level computing. And so these are mathematical simulation technologies. So like taking what you started with, Jason, about the grades and quantifying human experience into an equation, taking it to this whole next level. So creating gamification within our biologies that are actually set up as free market economies, and our consciousness, and all of that being run in a cybernetic way where the past experiments are maintained on ledgers, blockchain. Like, that's part of the cybernetics, is that you would have an ultimate ledger for referring back to at different layers. Like, you could drill down from a city to a neighborhood to a family to a person to an organ in their body. Like, you have this fractal, like this deep view across time and space. And I think that's, to me, the thing that is so again, I don't think they have that locked down yet. I think that's what they want to have locked down. I think that's where they're driving this, is to have that level of a ledger for prediction and management.
Yeah. The next one, introduction, pushing humanity forward.
Most of these are a little shorter than that one.
Okay. Let's see.
And this is sort of going chronologically through the video you shared with me, Jason. That's about a half an hour talk. I just pulled little clips.
Okay, perfect.
Breakthroughs in computing to push humanity forward. Today, we'll talk about vision, we'll talk about our impact, we'll talk about the network. And in this vision section, I want to describe what we mean by push humanity forward. Whenever we say that, what are we talking about concretely? I also want to talk about the what behind that push humanity forward. What are the kinds of projects, the kinds of ways that our network is having an impact in the world? And I want to finish with a discussion about how we approach this. How is it that we're building that kind of impact? What is unique about our system? What is unique about our network? Why we think that we can cause some impact in this set of projects that other groups can't. To set the context, over the last few hundred years, we've seen massive global improvement across most features of the human condition. Most ways that we measure it, humanity is just getting drastically better off. Now, at the same time, we have encountered a series of existential risks. We now have the capability of destroying ourselves and life, other forms of life on the planet. There's a massive set of extinction events happening, and we are encountering a range of problems that may mean the end of our species.
I was just thinking about that song from the 70s, I'm your pusher man. Remember that one? I don't know if you guys know that one.
We need Lynn. We need Lynn on here. She would know.
I know. Lynn would have jumped right in with me. But again, like we are facing all these problems, but the question is why? And we always, just from a larger philosophical point of view, it's like we see a problem and we need to like do something on top of it, as opposed to go back and maybe there's something we're doing that we shouldn't do. It's a totally different orientation about how to approach this. I mean, the idea that we pull back on the technology, pull back on maybe we shouldn't do some of this stuff, is maybe we should question money, capitalism, tokens, property, like the way that it's been constructed. Rethink that. That's out of the question. Let's just build on top of it. Aside from the fact that, there are other motivations here than just for protecting the planet and all that. So we could go into that as well, because clearly that's the case. But
in a different clip, he goes on to, I'm not sure if it's here, I think it probably is, how Bell Labs is their inspiration and who they look up to. So,
right. Yeah. All the DARPA, Bell Labs, all the people who actually created the problems and are profiting off the problems are going to be our saviors.
I guess they are following in the footsteps of Bell Labs pretty well. Creating new solutions. And so I'd be proud.
Well, and for me, I think this idea of impact means measurement. Like, it's built in. You can't have an impact if you don't have a baseline and then ongoing measurement. And so essentially what we're talking about is remaking the world in a way that is under constant data surveillance. Whether it's, essentially what they're going to try to sell it to you as is that you're empowered by being able to sell your data or hold your data as a commodity and as tokens or staking, and that you'll be an agent, like an active participant in the impact space. But the more I think about just the construct of social impact, which again, I've been swimming in this for like 7 years, but I think what's coming, the social part, is that in the complexity space, they actually want to know how you as an agent interact with other agents in the society. So that social impact is at two levels. The cybernetics is steering you and then steering you in relation to others. So all of it is embedded in measurement, and then all of it is also embedded in interaction, measuring all of these interactions. And so I think that's where, we're going to see, and my best guess is the response to the crypto stuff is going to be a more regulated system that actually creates Leoter's monetary ecology. Like they actually want a social currency, which I think is a different spin than the social credit score. Everyone now is talking about it as the social credit score. I think what they want to hand people is that you can be an individual, you can have your own values, and you can embed your values into your money. And we're going to call these new digital tokens that allow you to self-actualize through how you exchange with your beautiful money in the system. And that the complexity theorists are going to be mapping and modeling all of that. And you're going to have different sorts of holonic communities. Like they're actually it's not going to be a total lockdown of everyone doing the same thing. Like they actually, and they talk about it later, many thousands of flowers bloom. Like they want to have at this point petri dish experiments of lots of different societies to get all of the interaction data to feed into the system. Like they're fine to have like some conservative Christian libertarian Hollands over here and some like crunchy eco villages over there. Like they actually, for the initial stages of the data collection, they would like that. And so the social impact allows them, if they can get everyone, and so much of my experience in the quote unquote alt resistant space has been, I would say 85% of people are connected in some way to some sort of blockchain technologies. Those people are all going to run with that, right? Not appreciating, I think, that it's feeding into the swarm intelligence data layer, like at the end of the day. So so for me, impact and driving people forward. We're going to drive humanity forward, and that's the Huxley human plus. Like the forward is, we're going to, step out of your crappy body and like join the photonic consciousness cloud, like that's, and I think, they don't come straight out and say that, but later on he does mention like superpowers and things. So I think they're going to normalize the idea that we upgrade our biological systems to the point that eventually maybe we don't even need it at all.
Yeah. And I'll just go ahead.
You go. It's like, humanity by every measurement is doing this much better than we've been doing before. Whereas like, it's like, but how many just like overt genocides, like millions and millions and millions of like both like slavery and just like wiping out entire populations in all sorts of places and like all this other stuff. Like you can't, just because infant mortality might be better, like, less more babies are making to adulthood. It's like, you just can't look at things in that way where a number is justifying doing whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Well, how many people, of the people that I know, a very large percentage of the people I know are actually pretty miserable. And I know they'll say, well, this is going to make people happy. We're going to have an index for that and we'll be able to measure that. But when people are, that's going to be obviously manipulated when people are making money off of that. And there's an incentive, that's not going to be an accurate measurement anyways. And I know that I think part of happiness for me is for me personally is having independence and not having Big Brother or big tech, telling me what to do or what not to do. And I'll say something else too about the whole, you'll own your own data. I've thought a lot about this in terms of just money, even before, sweatshops. People don't have to work in a sweatshop in, poor villages. What's the alternative? Like they need this stuff called money in order to survive. And so in the future, if you need this token in order to get on the bus, and you need to get on the bus to go to work in order to get food or whatever, like you need, these tokens are going to be an absolute requirement to have to survive. But you're going to own your own data. But if you want the token, you have to give us you have to agree. You're going to have to agree to all these things that you're not even going to read. Like, we all know, like, we're already like downloading apps with all sorts of things on there that we don't actually agree with, but this is actually enforceable in terms of you need these tokens to survive. And so like the whole thing about your own data is just such a farce, because if you're coerced into doing the bidding of going in the direction, letting them push you, the pushing humanity forward based on their metrics. So I don't know, just some thoughts.
Totally.
Well, and I'll just reinforce in the web, this idea of decentralization and privacy is that for now, there's some sort of device that holds your wallet that has the token. And if the world that we build has a smart contract layer, there will be many times in which you're expected to present that wallet and they'll say, oh, it's just like a zero knowledge proof, or, oh, it's just something that's gonna, like, we're only looking for that one token. If you have it or you don't have it, we won't look at everything else. But if what you're trying to do is get on the bus or open the door or borrow the Internet of Things bike, and you are prohibited because you don't have the token, even though it's private and the data is stored in a decentralized way, it's still controlling your life. And anyone standing around you when you try to pull the bike out or get on the bus will know that you don't have the token. So it doesn't, like, that whole narrative about it being wonderful because it's decentralized and private, to me, just doesn't hold water, because we're creating a conditional world in which it doesn't really matter where the data is stored. Even if they're just looking at one token at a time, that's going to have profound impacts on how people navigate the world.
Yeah. Well, and they want it decentralized, or because they say the whole point of the internet was to make sure the communication system stayed up in case there was a nuclear war or whatever. So that's what they sell this as, is, it's like, you're not going to be able to take this thing down. If somebody says, you know what, I've had enough of this, they want to build a system that can withstand anything. And that's going to, so.
Well, and I will just emphasize, sorry.
No, you
just
go,
at the end, him saying like, or there's these extinction events, right? We can end the world. So that's the whole fear thing. Like the framing of all of this is we don't have any choice but to follow our recommended course of action or the world will end. So, and I'm not discounting that there are significant problems, but the imperative of if you don't do everything we say, the world will end is essentially like holding natural life on the planet hostage to the tokenizers. That is a key framing that they need to put forth. And I think in many respects, revisiting the whole Cold War in terms of understanding it possibly as advancing a covert World War III on consciousness and natural life, that like, okay, whoop, now we're back again. Like Huxley's UNESCO declaration in 1946 is saying like, oh my gosh, we're going to possibly, end each other over nuclear war. We have to figure out some way to get along. Well, like fast forward, we're just back in the same spot. And there are so many people panicked over, the threat of, the destruction of the planet through nuclear weapons. And I'm like, they're not building all of this to destroy the world. Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't do targeted situations or whatever, but they're not doing all of this to end it all. But it's very important that we live in the story that if we don't follow all of the requirements, either for climate or the nuclear stuff or whatever, that our cause is, that it's over. And I think that they use that to their advantage.
Yeah, they're not suicidal. And they're not dumb. They're not dumb. Okay, super.
Sorry, I also mentioned the Filecoin they have like a partnership with Lockheed Martin for space, for creating a communicating and computational satellite system for like space exploration and moon bases and stuff, and so they're doing that. But what you said, Jason, about decentralization has always been about, even like the crypto anarchist people from way back when, is about making the strongest possible network system, which is just inherently it's just a military operation. That's just what it is. It's just not what we're used to thinking of as military. It's just creating a structure that can, through both mental manipulation and convincing people to maintain the computers and create the circuits and all that stuff, to all the economic and cryptographic and mathematical like strategies of resilience. It's just...
Well, I'll bring up a quote which Marshall McLuhan, who actually was a supporter of a lot of the tech stuff, but his quote, I think that quote, "The medium is the message," and I actually, the first interview I did with Alison, I credited that quote to Aldous Huxley. I was wrong. It was actually Marshall McLuhan. I was trying to think who it was. But that idea, like the medium is the message. The medium is a thing in and of itself. It is a system, no matter how you structure it, it has certain characteristics in and of itself that value certain things over other things, that take away things. So like, that's what people, that whole, it's just a tool and depends on how we use it, is also a complete fiction. It's not just a tool. These technologies actually have embedded in them sets of values that are that you can't change. You can't program. In order to have this computer, a lot of things had to happen. Anyway, okay, superpowers, humanity's upgrade. I think we need maybe a downgrade. I'm not sure. Okay.
Think about the importance of the printing press. Think about the importance of writing, of language. Those structures radically altered the future of our species, of life on this planet, of our entire history. So in the last 80 years, computing has transformed our species. Superpowers now sit on our pockets, they sit on our desktops, they sit integrated in a vast array around the world. Decade over decade, there's been this tremendous, relentless improvement. Billions of humans and trillions of computers now work deeply integrated. Most human activity in some way is mediated by the internet and these superpowers in our pockets. The internet is constantly granting us new superpowers, and the key piece of that is that it's an open and permissionless network where any human, any group can get together, create, envision, and foresee a superpower, translate that into some code, ship it out to everyone else in the world, and the entire species patches up and upgrades. It's an amazing, amazing invention. And a lot of the benefits that we see today in the last 20 years are thanks to this open, permissionless network.
Leo, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one.
I don't know. I mean, like, it's just building. When you can see it, sometimes they lay it out so clearly that it's not humanity. It's just clearly building another thing. There's another system, and it's like all the stuff you're talking about, the emergent complex systems, like it's what's going on, and they need people to put their attention and will into continually developing the computers, the software and AI and everything else on top of it. And just, there's no, when you have a problem, you have to look inside of yourself and deal with yourself and choose what to do about the problem. You can't go to a machine and then that's what they're trying to tell you to do is all the problems that we have with each other. You just go to the machine and add to it, and that will give you a new ability, and you can get all the abilities that everyone else is adding to it, and that's going to make us bring us to this new level of awareness and consciousness, and fix all the problems, all the pollution, and all everything else. It's just, I don't know.
When he talks about it like it's not managed or anything, or it's not, on one hand he says we're going to push you, we've got nudges and these things, and then yet you can create something and then all of a sudden it'll spread to the world and everybody will love it. But it's also within this box that you're stuck inside of. And yes, you're getting, with your phone, you're getting some cool things that you could do, I can do, we're doing this call right here. We couldn't do that. So you might say that's a superpower. We're in different parts of the country and we're having this conversation, and that is a very cool thing that we can do here. But again, I've got Neil Postman on my mind a lot right now because I just started his book. But what is being lost? What's being taken away from us in this process? And I think that's a really important thing to think about, in all of this. And there are, I would say for every little superpower you're gaining, you're actually losing other greater superpowers that maybe aren't technocentric. I don't know. Alison?
Well, I would also say that this framing, and we talked about this a little bit, Jason, of the superpower and just in popular culture, the movies, the Marvel, that this idea of bio-nano engineering, it's going to fold in under the superpower, right? We're just going to give you an upgrade to what you could be if, and so it's going to stop being, medical interventions because you have, some really challenging health problem to just de rigueur, you just go for your regular upgrade and you call it a superpower. I would say the other thing is this idea that we have superpowers in our pockets. That's also part of, I think, that we have agency through our phone, which is important in terms of the refi crypto tokenization space, because that's something that like Trent McConaughey at Ocean Protocol has been sort of implying, that you can self-actualize by how you participate with your data and with tokenization through Ocean Protocol. That he literally is like, you can become a better person by self-actualizing through your participation in these sort of gamified token environments, and like realize yourself in more robust ways through this wallet interface, whether that's on a phone or however it presents later. So I do think that this idea that you have the superpower in your pocket is conditioning people to feel like their agency is through how they deploy payment systems on their phones to causes. And that's part of the values that are embedded in these new kinds of social currencies that are coming. And the other thing, I keep going back to Kevin Wereback and about the gamification of blockchain, and him telling the Wharton alumni, the game can be sometimes surprising and we might not know all the rules. So my advice is to be the game designer so you can make the rules. That's the inside info that the Wharton alumni get, is like, be the game designer. And so we know that sometimes like our phones or our computers like upgrade overnight into like a new operating system or something. And sometimes we get a chance to say we agree to it, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes those upgrades come with their own sets of headaches. But imagine that we've created a social protocol over the world, and like you go to bed one night and you wake up and it's a new set of rules. Like maybe just a few rules have changed, but you might not actually get a notification on like, oh, the new way to get on the bus is like this, you need this token. And so you go up to get on the bus and you can't get on. And so this idea of a gamified life where we have these cyber physical systems that are attached to like the tokens that we have in our wallet, when he says like, oh, you can get upgrade, like things like we can all get together and decide on upgrades for humanity. Like I'm looking at the flip side saying, you could be implementing a new game that is actually to my disadvantage based on how I understood the game last week.
Right.
And that's something that's like that when I keep saying, guys, like half of your intellectual free time should be spent on understanding what Web3 is and the implications of it, beyond whatever you must understand about crypto investments. It is this other thing, because it's that important. And we see it like in popular media and, Nosedive, Black Mirror, these things. They're telling us then the question is, how far off are we on the time horizon to this really happening in a meaningful way? Yeah.
Well, on the pop culture thing, or like the comic book thing, yeah, it is funny because like all of the, these superheroes typically got their superpowers from exposure to radiation or chemicals. If you go back to the go back to the origin stories,
elements of DuPont, union carbide,
or they came from another planet. But a lot of them it was toxic exposure. So that was kind of interesting. I just thought of something in terms of like having control, having your life being, these apps and things like telling you what to do. I hate Dropbox as a company, but just file storage. But I've yet to find a good file storage where I can upload and download like quickly, because I have a lot of files. I do video that I need to share a lot of times. So, but I couldn't upload it using the web interface. So they're like, oh, you got to download the app on your computer. So I download the app on my computer, and it actually basically is like acting as another thing on my computer. It doesn't look like it, but it'll open my Explorer box when I do Dropbox, and whenever I plug in an external hard drive, this thing pops up and it's like, do you want to back up your files? Do you want your backup your files? It's like hungry. It's like hungry for my files. And then there's a little, Windows has a thing that says, no, do not ask again. If I click on do not ask again, it just ignores that. Every time it pops up, it's like, hey, can we have your files? Can we have your files? Anyways, I was just thinking about that in this conversation, because I'm like, no, I don't want to give you my files. Like, I don't even want this on my computer, but I had to use it for this job that I'm doing. But anyway, I don't know how that relates, but it just like,
use Filecoin.
Huh?
You could probably use Filecoin.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Well, that's still giving. So I'm like old school. Like I'm like, I want my hard drive. Like I want to have my, I want to have control. You say, well, I own my own data. Then can I have my own data, please? Like literally, like physically. No.
You gotta get your private key on your hard drive and
Exactly. So, but that's what we're doing. We're submitting ourselves to these systems that are going to now intermediate what we could have just done on our own without that. Like you're submitting to these things that are putting themselves in between you and doing stuff, and so that's a problem.
I feel like that what you just that last sentence sums it up really well. It's putting itself between you and what you do, like yourself and your people. It's just inserting there, and it wants you to ask it to do that and to continually let it insert itself in every aspect of your life.
Right.
Relationships.
Yeah. And that might have been like what do they call that where you say something out of context or whatever? That's a weird segue, sort of not a segue, but what do they call that?
Yeah, I know.
What's that word? But anyways, I just thought of that as we were talking here. I was like, yeah, this is one little thing, but there's lots of little examples where that happens, you know. So anyways, not to get distracted here, surveillance and verifiable contracts. So we'll do that one next.
Now, at the same time, the infrastructure that we're building, this computing system, is giving a lot of power to a few groups. We've talked a lot about, corporate surveillance and so on in the last 10 years. But what I'm particularly worried about is state surveillance. There's already mass surveillance going on at the same time. However, we have not yet seen what's possible. Orwell famously described this tremendously dark world in 1984, but I think that was child's play. The kind of 1984 vision of the future does not at all factor in the kind of control systems that you can put in place today. Not in the future, not in 10, 20 years, today, using today's technology. Already we're seeing these kinds of systems being played around with across the world. This is not just in a far-off place, it's probably in your country. And if they work really well, and they'll start spreading and exporting to other nations. And this is a very, very pernicious system that over time will ratchet up into something potentially really bad. And the concern is one of these. It's at every point in time, the people that are building these things are trying to do a really good thing. They're trying to help secure systems, and they're trying to help secure society. Because they know the damage and the dangers that come when safety is not carefully considered. However, never about the current administration. It's always about who's going to inherit in the future that set of powerful capabilities. Don't build extremely powerful technology that you wouldn't want the worst groups on the planet taking control over. So it's extremely critical that we build the structures to prevent this kind of mass social control in the future. Now, this is where Web3 comes in. Web3 brings verifiability to interactions across the internet. It makes sure that we embed cryptographic requirements in most interactions across the network. And I'm not talking about kind of like the ownership thing. Like that's been, I think that's a kind of passing moment thing about Web3, because property rights are pretty interesting and pretty cool to have on the network. However, what's much more important, much more deep, is to bring verifiability, to make these systems trustable for everybody, because you have hard mathematical and cryptographic and economic guarantees about their operation. You don't have to trust that some contract is going to be respected. You need a communications infrastructure that respects you, a communications infrastructure that puts the data in your control, and that isn't going to just take everything you've ever said and later on in 10, 20 years in the future, punish you for it because of some like massive shift in what has become acceptable.
Insert laugh track. Yeah, I mean, that's just, well, and that whole thing about like, oh, it's the state. And it's like, no, it's actually, I mean, the state plays a role for sure. But I mean, yeah, the idea that the biggest threat is not really coming from the state. To me, the state is actually ancillary to real power this day and age. But anyway, thoughts?
It's about the outside-in robot.
Yeah.
I mean, like, it wants to know that you are you, and you're supposed to know that what part of it you're interacting with. And I don't know. Did we just say something about this, Jason, about like trust the math or the math? I guess it was maybe that woman from Epic the epic health systems. Like,
well, Sergey Navarov,
oh yeah,
said,
that's right.
made a comment about that, and actually, that's kind of what this Neil Postman thing was getting at. Of like, just it's all trusting numbers. It's like your understanding of the world is all through numbers. So
yeah, and
Yeah.
just like the dichotomy of state versus corporate surveillance is just completely meaningless and just isn't
Right.
worth like talking. If you just, I don't know, this is obviously not like an intelligent way of viewing things, but yeah, I mean, I think it really leads to that it wants to be a collective phenomenon, and it wants to do that in whatever way that it can be sold to people, so that it's like, okay, if we need to make it as private as possible or in ways that we can convince you that this won't be used against you and it will actually help your well-being and make it so that you can have heat and eat food, then like we'll do that to make sure that you comply with it or want to use it. So, and then that seems to be more the goal, just getting people to use this stuff.
yeah, well, and the idea of contracts, who's writing the contracts? It's not you. You're a signer.
Yes.
You're a signer of the contract. You're not the author of a contract. And I think that's a really important thing to recognize. And people always look at, when they talk about DAOs, they act like, oh, it's this small group of people. They got together and they like, let's organize our little nonprofit that's building a community garden over here as a DAO. And like, and our decision making will be run through the DAO. That's not what the majority of it's going to be. Yeah, you'll have your little small community DAO, but it's going to be these large institutions and large structures that are going to be the DAO that are you're going to have your token vote, which is going to be meaningless, just like it is with our democracy. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm going off here, but like the idea of the contract, I think, is another thing that needs to really be discussed and talked about, because again, what contracts are made without coercion and also like awareness. Like, again, people are agreeing to contracts that they don't even really understand what they're agreeing to.
Yeah, and it's the least human way to have an agreement with someone else.
Yeah.
If I have an understanding, like with my girlfriend, that like I don't know, it's like, I'll just buy whatever, just some agreement about something to do with money. Like, I don't want a mathematical description of that agreement and how.
Right. Well, and what you're talking about is the removal of human, individual autonomy or human. It's like you're putting yourself into the robot or the machine.
Yeah, and I think what you said, like, I don't know. This is more of like a far out, just kind of opinion or inkling of mine, but I feel like law in a lot of ways is the predecessor, like having legal codes, having natural language descriptions of all things and what's acceptable and how, and the processes of recourse for certain actions, just is, to me, it's just like very much seems like this, or it's the same thing in the way that it's creating like a mirrored version of reality. It's creating, it's not quantified totally in the way that this is like hardcore quantification and like binary mathematics, but it's an abstraction of reality to create a sort of parallel system that's parallel to just like natural interaction of natural chaos or whatever, eating stuff and pooping.
Well, one of the things I was trying to play around with yesterday a little bit was like Stan Ulam, his development of this Monte Carlo algorithm and this idea of like decision trees and using supercomputing for these variables. And so there would be sort of this broad decision cone of all of these various options. And then from within that, you would calculate your appetite for risk or whatever, and you would choose one of them. But if you could imagine like modeled holons, like some sort of like units of social society where there was some variation in the decision tree. And I think that's part of, I think the smart contracting is there's this, do you pronounce it deontic logic, like sort of ways of saying like you have to do something, you can't do something, you may do something. There are these hierarchies, but there is some variability in there. And then the branching patterns. And so when you're talking about the simulation, I almost feel like once they get enough granularity to have digital twins of agents, and the agents can both be people, they could be objects, machine, consciousness, anything with unique identifier. They could sort of model out the simulation in terms of almost like a multiverse, right? And then it's like choose your own adventure, only like you've already seen how they all end. And so then you pick a path, that's like the most comforting to you. And, in some ways, like the cybernetic protocol, they may say that that's optimal. Like we'll figure out for each person what their best self is, like what their best future we'll predict it in this massive computer and we'll give you what you want. Right. But then there's this larger existential question of like, is that life if there's never any friction or there's never any like challenge? And at the same time, if you have challenges, I've talked with Cliff about this some in the past, that you are the sum total of your past experience and that you can't actually evolve beyond that. Like you're dragging it as a rock along with you forever. Like, whereas like someone with maybe a criminal record or a bad relationship or something, like you could never sort of detach from that and create a new opportunity that is beyond the limitations that's imposed by that. Like once you have the ledger and the simulations, that it seems like some of these things are in play, although you've quantified human life and emotion and experience into a number. So then as that, you put it into the simulation, I can see different ways of it being played out in that space. And I don't know, like, it's just sort of a thought experiment for me, but like the people who are writing the contracts and deciding on what the paths are the ones that have the real power. And I don't think that's going to be regular people. Yeah.
For sure. And you're not going to be able to just do whatever you want. I mean, it's, they're going to have, you're going to have extra rewards. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's pushing and nudging and steering and guiding and, the path. And that is the exact opposite of someone having some sort of free will and pursuing their own thing. That's not what this is. So it's removing the human element out of all this and putting us into this other thing that, yeah, there's wiggle room, but the goal and the end point is not determined by you. So, yeah.
And like, I feel like we have like the other pieces in the simulation, they maybe give you superpowers in the simulation, but outside of the simulation, like we actually have access to life, like they want to play around with like biophotons, like with ultrasound in your brain or zapping you, but like you don't need them. And you actually, like, if we could tune into life itself, like that's a different kind of, you wouldn't frame it as a superpower, but like there is this larger, like, reciprocal connection to life itself that can exist outside of the simulation. And I think they want to distract people from that part. Like, only do the biophotons that we prescribe you. Like, don't go wandering around in the real world in nature or with people you care about and then make other natural biophotons, for goodness sake. We don't know how to measure that. We don't get a good read on all of that. So,
have you heard of the story of Thamus? Do you know, and Thuth?
No.
Thuth. He puts this little thing. It was the Egyptian. I was going to see if I could find it here. Someone by the name of Thuth, Theuth, had come to Thamus, who was like the king of Upper Egypt, I guess, and he figured out a way to write. And so he was I've got this new technology about showing people how to write, and so but then the Themis said, but yeah, but that's, and we're gonna be able to share information, but he was saying that this is actually going to change the way that we think and what we define as wisdom. And so I mean everyone we take for granted, like, of course, writing, like, that's such a great thing, but even there, there was something that was lost in that introduction. So he was pushing back on that and saying, yeah, but like we're going to, we go to the book now. We go to the book to find out the truth rather than like looking around us and experiencing it. So there's going to be a loss there. Anyways, but yeah, Neil Postman has an interesting thing about that in here too. But
and that's probably okay. I'll just go real quick. That's probably also Thoth, which is like in like Masonry and Hermeticism. There's like some long name that like Thoth, Tris, Hermagus, something is like their not their god exactly, but that's like their epitome of wisdom. And that Egyptian Thoth that's the same. And Hermes, so like
it might be Thoth then, yeah.
It's probably Thoth.
I'll just read this real quick. So this is out of Neil Postman's Technopoly book, and it's in the first chapter, Judgment of Thamus, and it's the story comes from Plato's Phaedrus, and it's told by Socrates to his friend Phaedrus in the story, and so Thamus once entertained the god Thuth, who was the inventor of many things, including number, calculation, geometry, astronomy, and writing, and Thuth or Thoth, I'm not sure if it's Thuth or Thoth. Anyway, Thuth exhibited his inventions to the king, claiming that they should be widely available and known to all Egyptians. And so then Thamus is kind of questioning this. And so it reads, Thamus inquired into the use of each of them, and as Thuth went through them, he expressed approval or disapproval according as he judged to Thuth's claims to be well or ill-founded. When it came to writing, Thuth declared, "Here is an accomplishment, my lord, my king, which will improve both the wisdom and memory of the Egyptians. I have discovered a sure receipt for memory and wisdom." To this Thamus replied, "Thuth, my paragon of inventors, the discoverer of an art is not the best judge of good or harm which will accrue to those who practice it. So it is in this you, who are the father of writing, have out of fondness for your offspring attributed to it the great opposite of its real function. Those who acquire it will cease to exercise their memory and become forgetful. They will rely on writing to bring these things to their remembrance by external signs instead of their own internal resources. What you have discovered is a receipt for recollection, not memory. And as for wisdom, your pupils will have the reputation for it without the reality. They will receive a quantity of information without proper instruction, and in consequence be thought very knowledgeable when they are for the most part quite ignorant. And because they are filled with the conceit of wisdom instead of real wisdom, they will be a burden to society. Pretty harsh.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Academia.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, I'm thinking about all these people with PhDs that like can't understand like basic things that are about how the world actually operates. You know, they're stuck. Even those things that you were looking at, Alison, that conference with all those intellectuals discussing, what was the name of that? The arrogant, the arrogant intellectuals discussing. I need to find that video. That's actually worth having a whole show about. Do you know which one I'm talking about, Alison? And you said Bernie Madoff was in the room.
Oh yeah, the neuroeconomics.
The neuroeconomics guys, yeah. But I mean, these guys like they didn't understand like a basic principle, you know. But they're so heady, you know.
Well, it's what story you're living in, I think.
Yeah.
And I will say, just on the reading part, in the time that I've been living in Philadelphia, they relocated the school district building administrative headquarters to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the old Philadelphia Inquirer building, the newspaper building, but it was the part of the building that held the printing presses. And it was quite an unusual building because it was very long. It was maybe 4 or 5 feet high, but it was very long because the presses needed to be long, and it had very few windows. So it was a very odd choice for an office building because most of the people working there like have no window or anything like that. Like it was an odd use to convert from, although symbolically actually really impressive if you think about pressing information into a medium, like actually symbolically very relevant. So
and like
it was only years later that I realized the significance of that. I'm like, oh, that's actually pretty significant.
Well, I'm very impressed by intellectuals. Yeah. But and you know, Neil Postman is actually, I mean, he got famous for his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which he was actually arguing in favor of writing and the thought processes that go on with reading and writing versus television. So this was in the mid 80s. So I mean, he put this in his book. I mean, he was just like, but even before that, there were people questioning, you know, wait a minute, like, should we be reading and writing? Is that necessarily good? Or like viewing everything as a number? Is that necessarily, you know, what are we losing in that process? You know, anyways,
the oldest pieces of writing that they found being debt agreements and
the Sumerian tablets.
Babylon. It's like, yeah.
I mean, the other piece of that I've been working on lately, and I want to talk about it some with Cliff, is that this finding of this the Wycliffe Bible College or Bible Institute, and that they had this summer of linguistics back during the 60s, 50s and 60s, where they went into the Amazon and they cut out airstrips to collect up the indigenous languages to make Bibles, like to translate it into a written language to make a Bible. But it turns out that Texas Instruments was one of the main backers of the creation of this campus outside of Dallas for this. It became this International Linguistics Institute, which I think is still there. And so I feel like it was about getting indigenous cosmology into the machine, like largely under the guise of Bible translations. But even so, like the holding that difference of an indigenous cosmology that's based in a particular geographic space and time that is directly related and not written, and then the process of coming in, commandeering that under a certain intention, and then feeding it into, because now this same system has really sophisticated linguistic like database dashboards, like really complex linguistic, like an etymological stuff, which I think goes back to some of the bibliography stuff that we've talked about, Leo, and like making some sort of ordered, structured information being that like a subset of that is like etymological linguistic analysis of indigenous language. And the American Philosophical Society, actually, I didn't realize it because I just went on I got an email, but they're having their annual meeting today. And they've been pouring lots of money into indigenous language studies too lately. So there were several, there's a whole section on incarceration, including Elizabeth Hinton, whose book I've referenced often, but then also other things on indigenous language. So I think it's still very relevant, this idea of language, your relationship to your environment, how it gets codified, what happens once it gets codified in various mediums, whether it's print or digital or contractual.
Yeah, we could do a whole show on language itself. When I don't know if you guys have watched that documentary that I've talked about, Grammar of Happiness. I might have I probably shared the link, but it was a linguist who went to, I think the Prai, I can't remember the name of the indigenous culture, but he went down there both as a missionary and a linguist. But the whole documentary was he was trying to convert them, but he was never able to do that. And they're like, you're telling us we're sinners and we're telling us we need God, but we already have God. Like it's all around us. Like, what are you talking about? but he ended up actually kind of like losing his faith in the process, or at least the faith that he had, and really kind of rethinking how he thought about the world. It's an interesting documentary. But what was interesting about this tribe was they didn't have words for numbers other than like that 1, 2, and then like a bunch. And so in the film they say, so like a mother wouldn't know, a mother with 5 children, you said how many children she would, have, like she wouldn't be able to tell you. And he's like, no, but she would be able to tell you who they are and, everything about them. Yeah. But it wasn't important. Like it's not relevant to say, oh, I have 5 children. That's not really an important thing. And then also like they had a lot of their language it's all present tense, so it's really interesting, and it changes like the way that they view the world, the way they think about the world is radically different because of the language that they use, or vice versa. The languages they use is because that's the chicken and the egg sort of thing. But it's a really interesting documentary. I think you can probably find it on YouTube. It's called The Grammar of Happiness. Okay, next one. That's really cool. Digital human rights, world run by International Digital Utility. All right.
Can't wait.
I know, this is so well. I sent this to Alison, and I'm just like, oh my! I don't even remember what I said, but I was like the hubris, or I don't remember what I said, but I was like, this guy is. I mean,
but people need to know. They don't know. Like even the people who think they're super informed don't know.
Right. Well, I shouldn't say this guy because it's not about Juan Benet or whatever.
The more you back into like seeing where this came from, especially, I don't know, like for me, like the late 80s and early 90s of cryptography and digital identity, like it's very clear. It's not any one person. Like it feels like they pick and choose who to put up in front of different parts to stand in for the thing. Like the guy with the network state, like, I'm not saying he didn't write his book, but like that was a book that was going to get written by somebody, and he happened to be the one that says, here, stand in front of this book so we can talk about, liquid democracy and online governance.
Yeah. Well, they have ghost writers, but they probably have ghost CEOs or something. I don't know. All right. Yes.
If you want the world to ratchet up into a better system, you have to make it drastically easier to use. You have to make it more convenient. Users will not select privacy. Users will not select security. Users will select convenience and fun. Oftentimes, people dismiss the requirements, but it's important that you think about your superpowers as riding on top of a massive scale, international computing infrastructure that's run by a set of corporations. So the application stack and the personal computing devices, those end up being manufactured and controlled by various different groups. There's probably a problem there in terms of the number of manufacturers for computing devices. We probably need a lot more groups to do that. However, it's extremely difficult. Now, the layers below are actually pretty good. When you think about the openness of the internet and the openness of the networks, that's working quite well. The problem sits below. The way that the internet is steered today is through a series of contracts, terms of services, and the action of various corporations and courts around the world. Those contracts can change very easily. Those courts can decide things in the future that are different from the past. So what we need to really upgrade our systems is to create a layer that won't change, that has hard requirements for change, that has a much stronger foundation. We want math, cryptography, and economics to underlie the structure of the internet, to underlie the security of our communications network, and to guarantee your future access to these communication systems. I think most of you have not been in a country that suddenly overnight disabled the internet, but more and more people every day are encountering that kind of experience, and it could happen anywhere. So these kinds of infrastructure improvements can lead to public, international, digital utilities. Don't think of them as corporations. Think of them as a utility that is there for the benefit of all, for the benefit of all of humanity, not run by any one group, but run by the math, by the cryptography, and by the economics behind them. Through that, we can establish these digital human rights. And from there, we should get them ratified. But I think we're in a moment where we should build them first and ratify them second. So that's why a lot of us are working on Web3.
Wow. Yeah. Don't think of them as a corporation. There's a lot in that one, actually. Yeah. And the digital human rights, it's not just, you don't just need human rights. It's now you've got another layer. You got another layer on top of it. I used to talk a lot about like how the idea of property rights actually subverts the idea of human rights. The idea of human rights is I have a right to live and survive and do, whatever, to speak, whatever. And property rights is a layer on top of that. I derive my rights through the property that I own. And this is like another one. You derive your rights through the digital space. So I don't know. That's just an interesting thing that I thought about. You guys?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like kind of similar to what we had just talked about with humans' superpowers on top of all the other technological layers below, and that's not really, it's just powers in the machine world. I mean, I think definitely, like when we were talking about the brain-computer interfaces earlier, and Alison, how you're saying that's going to be sold as like public goods or rights to those technologies that you need to function in the world with. I think that, this sort of thing's coming from a very similar place.
Well, also the layer of that's unchangeable. I don't think the problem about rules or laws is that they can be changed. It's that who's changing them and for what purposes. Obviously there's a lot of things, there's a lot of laws and rules that absolutely need to be changed. It's just who decides what that change is going to be and when and why and how. The idea of having a layer that's unchangeable, is a little disturbing to me as well. And again, based on math. I think there's a deeper fundamental question of like, is that really the best way to organize society? Like, is that really what we are about as human beings, is viewing everything as a mathematical model, as everything's a number? I don't subscribe to that. And a lot of people don't, actually. And a lot of people in this space actually don't, if you actually dig down deep enough. It's just we're being bamboozled, I think is the word. Alison?
Well, I would just say one of the things that when I was looking into the Santa Fe Institute, this guy, I think it's George Cowan, he talked about giving a paper on social entropy in 1956 at the Aspen Institute. And I've been like keeping an eye out on the Aspen Institute for a long time, but I didn't realize it was that old. I guess, a lot of these things seem to pop up in the 70s, out of sort of this technocracy movement. And I was a little surprised that it was that early. And it was actually dated to initially started around 1947. And then I think there was a big celebration in 1949 tied to the Goethe bicentennial, which is quite interesting because I've been looking into, at some point I have to suck it up and probably read Faust, because I do feel like that this Faustian bargain that's being made with the devil for knowledge and experience is part of this. But they had, and it was quite touchy to have this in Aspen, again, Colorado, right? The blockchain, it's interesting to think about, because you guys are really a test bed for a lot of these blockchain technologies, that it was a Chicago businessman who was taking over this, it was an abandoned mining town, and remaking it, and they kicked off this whole big thing. But emerging out of this guy Pepka, who was the guy who was redeveloping Aspen, he was a trustee at University of Chicago. And I was telling Jason the other day that what I realized is that Pepka, and among others, the chancellor of the University of Chicago at the time, which was, again, backed by Rockefeller, like the original one burned, and then Rockefeller gave a bunch of money to rebuild it. In 1947, they actually set up a committee to draft a world constitution. And this organization went on for 7 years, and the records of it are at the University of Chicago. It's like the Chicago Committee for the World Constitution, which when you stop and you sort of think about, Jim Heckman's equations and Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys and Argonne and the Met Lab and all of these things, and you're like, okay, so these guys are wanting to birth out a world federation, right? And under Huxley, right? Because you come out of World War II and you say, look, all these terrible things that happened, and look, we have this Cold War looming. So we really just need some sort of global structure so that this doesn't happen again. And, you know, I can see us sort of repeating back into that phase. So this international layer of unchanging contracts, and the fact that, as he kept repeating, that the economics was baked into the bottom layer. Like, it was the cryptography and the math and the economics. Like, I mean, to me, the fact that the economics was baked into the foundation is significant, especially the more I realize that this pushing humanity forward in this emergence is built around an evolutionary landscape. And this idea of evolution being that the person with the winning gene pool or the winning experience set or the winning toolbox, like, goes on to the next round of competition. It's this ongoing competition to the next till we get to collective consciousness. And so evolution, I think, is structured as an economic imperative. Like, I think that biophysics is that. Like, biophysics and econophysics and the ways in which possibly these brain-computer interfaces with nanotech and tokenization of economics and, you know, Trent McConaughey's idea about, like, improving your self-actualizing through your exchanges in the blockchain, it all fits together. And so anyway, that stood out to me, is that base layer includes not only the math and the cryptography, but that it is economics. And to me, that says, when I'm starting to see economics now, I'm thinking more about genetic algorithms and evolution, like collective and individual evolutionary, guided evolution, I guess.
Well, and on the markets, on the markets versus capitalism argument that I would have with people, and trying to get them to understand the difference between the two things, they're looking at, like, a market as people, you know, I'm a free agent in this market, and I can, you know, create products and buy and sell products and do all this. I can do this activity, and I was trying to explain. Understanding it in terms of layers, you know, layer 1, layer 2 is really helpful, because I was trying to explain to people that the monetary system and our laws around property, the money and property are like the layers 1 and 2, or I don't know how to frame that, but that actually set the stage. Set the rules that now you're free to operate within that. And so people totally ignore that piece of it. And like when he's talking about, we're going to create a layer that you can't change, that's like, okay, you know, here's the game board, everybody jump out there, now go. And you're like, well, wait a minute, like the idea that you don't like the game board itself, or you don't like the purpose of it, or, you know, like that's off the table. You have to play the game. And, you know, I don't know. I think that's a really good, like, analogy in terms of, you know, looking at it as in terms of layers. You know, even with law, there's different jurisdictions and whatnot. But I'll have to work on that a little bit in terms of how to, like, visualize that. But yeah.
Like what you were saying too, like, Alison, the whole thing's built on, like, Bitcoin. It was like. And a lot of people argue it's more of like an economic innovation. You know, it's incentivizing people to secure a network protocol in a way by creating currency for doing that. So that's at, like, the core of all these protocols is the economics of it. And same with, you know, proof of stake's the same thing. And yeah, so I think that's something that people don't quite appreciate, that it's like fundamentally blockchain tokenizing everything is financializing everything, and that it's also the sort of ammunition of that world too. It's both how it's secured, but it's also how it defends itself, which is sort of doesn't really make sense, but it's, yeah.
Well, and there is a hierarchy within that in terms of different sets of values being pushed up against one another. And in those situations, what does the system, what does the math favor? that's built into the system, and it's inhuman. It's not you submit to it. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting what you were saying about securing itself, because I was doing some reading about the economic simulation models from this guy Holland, and in the 90s, and it was talking about like Citigroup actually backed a lot of this early econophysics at Santa Fe, and the models were based on like immune systems. So when you think about defense and biophysics and econophysics, like that, they were modeling the economic resilience, or like a structural resilience on an immune system model, like such as it is. And I know there's like people have questions about all of that in and of itself, but even that, like taking a biological process and then modeling it against, like, I don't know, the interface between artificial neural networks and biological neural networks, and the ways in which these mathematical simulations like bleed over into the economics is pretty interesting. And I do want to just mention one other thing. In these last two clips, he's sort of centered the conversation around the freedom of speech, which I think, honestly, it goes back to like fake news and regulating information in the simulation. Like if you can, it's like Google's PageRank algorithm. Maybe you don't have to actually eliminate it, but if you can press it so far down that no one pays attention to it, it's as good as eliminated.
I'd say it's better than eliminating it in many ways.
Yeah, disingenuous about that, like somehow Web3 is going to protect freedom of speech, because even within this last go round with Twitter, such as it is, this idea of verification, even though itself I think has been set up to fail, to move to continue to advance the agenda around more secure digital identity. But even that, they were saying, like, if you met this threshold of verification, we would promote your content higher than people who hadn't submitted to that level of verification. And so even like, that's just totally clear within the Web3 space. Like they may not throw you out of an airplane for saying something that you said, but they can make sure no one hears it. Like, and, I think we've all seen how that works. And what I keep, reminding people, like tap, tap, tap. If there's something that's trending on social media, it's because it actually serves the system that it's trending in some way. Like step back and actually, you might have to twist it over and turn it over a couple times to realize how it's actually serving the system, or how it's advancing the preferred narrative in some ways, either through opposition or advancement. But things don't just naturally go viral in these platforms. And I think the same for freedom of speech. They may not kill you for it, but they can certainly make sure that you're silenced, or effectively silenced, in the digital sphere.
Yeah, well, not just the digital, but the psychological. I mean, think about like how we're trying to get people to see, people that and you're having a conversation with face to face, and it's just like it can't enter into their consciousness what you're saying. You're like, literally, it's like, did you just hear what I said? Like, I mean, you can agree with it, disagree with it, but respond to it. And there's not even a response to it. It's a response to something else. It's kind of crazy. It's really, really wild.
Well, they have that ultrasound, Jason. They can get past the blood-brain barrier.
They've got to get through that. Maybe they've already done it. maybe they're a lot further than they're telling us. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's crazy.
But what's happening is that we lack the structures to be able to invest in our future. We don't have a way to, as a species, as humans, as individuals and groups, be able to invest in that long-term future. That's a problem in our economics, and we need to fix it. The good news is we have cryptoeconomics today. You don't have to go and create new types of structures and so on in an extremely difficult way. You can build them out of smart contracts, deploy them to these networks, and scale them. And that's extremely, extremely promising. It means that you can build totally new economic primitives, totally new ways of organizing large groups and organizing industries out of smart contracts. That's an extremely interesting way of upgrading these kinds of problems. So I'm a strong believer in the potential here. I think that this is one of those things that is early today. I think my sense around all of the economic primitives that are being explored is that it is as impactful as crypto itself, meaning when Web3 was first starting, when the first blockchains were appearing, it feels a lot like the new primitives that are being talked about today. So I'm really hopeful that in the next 5-10 years, we're going to be able to experiment with a lot of new structures and scale. And we design a lot of the structures around Protocol Labs itself with this in mind. A couple of small plugs. One is there's a very interesting set of financial primitives for doing climate change correction. Being able to decarbonize the planet will likely come from the legibility that Web3 gives us. It gives us the ability to create many more and more interesting and verifiable financial instruments for causing improvement. And there's also groups experimenting with full retroactive impact markets, where you're able to create impact markets for actually having significant positive impact on certain goals. So all of this is super interesting.
So
super interesting.
It is actually super interesting. I agree with him on that. It's interesting. And that clip might be out of place for some people that are watching this, because it might be a little confusing about some of the stuff he's talking about. So like we get into like hypercerts and
could you pull up the image of the triple jump checker thing from Holland? I think it was like the third page. Is that possible?
Sure.
So, because I think it's, to me, finding where it's actually coming from. So, to me, because I like the history stuff too. Like, I like taking the history and then looking forward, like seeing where we're at and projecting forward, because I think it's that continuum that I find the most interesting. So this was a bulletin of the Santa Fe Institute in the winter of 1994, right? So I was in grad school in 1994. I was just a baby, And so these are the things that are already being conceptualized. And I will say the early years of the Santa Fe Institute, they were applying complexity theory to economic systems. And this money was coming from MacArthur Foundation, Carnegie, and Citigroup. And so what he's saying about, we don't have an economic model to finance future goods. It's essentially the construct is just that short-term gains, we don't have things to do long-term or retroactively fund things that turned out to be good for society. And what I'm saying is, in 1994, John Holland was already conceptualizing the theory behind that of retroactively applying credit for something that was counted as a public benefit. And so this is an article about this first Stam Ulam lecture that was given at the Santa Fe Institute in 1994. It says, a deep theoretical question is how to assign credit to a rule that occurs much earlier in the system's behavior, he said. This time Holland used as an example involving the game of checkers. Say you make a move early in the game that later sets up a triple jump, he said. How do you get credit assigned back to that earlier rule, which later led to the triple jump? This is a difficult problem. Rules used in the past may not get credit for outcomes or behavior that takes place in the present. And so, when I'm reading that, the first thing that comes to mind is the ledger. The ledger keeps track of all of the actions in the play of the game and can retroactively trace back from any given outcome all of the sub-outcomes that led up to that point. And, with supercomputers, they can run those different outcomes super fast, boom, and you could trace it back. And so within the space of social impact finance and regenerative finance in these financialization tokenomics is they can start tracing all of these interventions and not only assign credit, but probably this is what the hypercerts might be saying, percentages of credit, right? Did you do a lot of work on that? So you get more responsibility. Oh, you just popped in for that one conference and chimed in the working group. You get a token amount of credit. And so that within this world of I feel like this is the kind of stuff that probably the quantum supercomputing is good at, is sort of these basic queries. Once we move into this quantum, cyber physical world, everything is going to start to be counted, right? What is that? Isn't that IXO, right? Everything has to be counted, or, anything that, it's this quantification. And And in the simulation, it's almost like you can run back time. Like you can like, whoop, I want to rewind time back to this certain point and figure out something. And so in the simulations, time starts to get really weird because it can move backwards. You can project forward in the simulation, and you can do it, I think, at different speeds for different purposes. And so I feel like the hypercert, when we next see the next clip and they're talking about hypercerts, it actually at least dates back to this concept in 94, if not earlier. I'm sure he built on somebody else's mathematical concept that dates before 1994, but that really stood out for me when I read it, that like, wow, that's a blockchain case use study.
Well, another thing I was thinking, go ahead, Leo.
Oh, just how, because they always talk about this like not nonlinear interactions and complexity theory and emergence. It's sort of like dissecting it, because it's like, oh, okay, we can see with the ledger and the computation, we can see which little things like led to that unexpected result, and then like take that information and use it for the next project and stuff.
It's mining. It's almost like I'm mining the unexpected.
Well, another aspect of this is, I've been looking into Palantir, and their whole business model is collecting massive amount of data and then predicting the future. So there's the future prediction, which they can actually influence through the prediction, through the decision making. Basically, you have Palantir, this one company, that all of these other companies are handing over their decision-making power to supposedly their algorithms that are saying, well, this is what the algorithm is telling you this is the best decision to make. And of course, they're not going to pay Palantir all this money to not take the advice of Palantir. So, I mean, it's a situation where they can both predict the future and then bet on the prediction in the future. I mean, time travel movies are always confusing because there's always these weird dichotomies and these really problematic things in the storyline. But it is a situation where it's like they can play both sides, I think, and that's another aspect of it that I think is really interesting, because this whole thing is built on a lot of the smart city infrastructure, and the data-driven governance is built on predictive modeling. And so the future is built on prediction, and then the past is bet on, and then you pay out. And I don't know. I haven't fully thought through this thing, because I think I need like a chart or a map or something like to figure it out. But
I can help you out with
oh, I know someone who does those things. But I think that there's some contradictions there. But anyway.
But it's interesting to think about Palantir moving to Denver, right? Which is in the middle of the blockchain state. That like if they were going to use a ledger-based technology of tracking these outcomes, like probably Colorado is the optimal, like the logical place that you would relocate to do that next phase. And they're involved in the pay for success finance deal verification. So
yeah, and our governor, Jared Schultz, who he changed his name to Polis, which we all know what Polis is. But anyway, yeah, his real name is actually Jared Schultz, but he was the richest man in I can't remember if he was I can't remember if he was a senator or a congressman. I didn't follow it that closely. But yeah, he made all his money in technology, and so and he's been at ETH Denver, and he's been a very strong advocate. He just got reelected too, so onward.
And I would say, just again on the checkers, that's a game board that's set. So that's the embedded economic layer in which the rules are the rules. So the triple jump being like this optimal move within the game, like that's already pre-assigned by the rules. And so I just want to emphasize that as all of this stuff is being set up as the ostensible rules of stakeholder capitalism is public benefit, but someone gets to decide what is actually the benefit and what tools you use to get to the public benefit. And so like if the person decide, if the entity's deciding that it is like total decarbonization, right? And that's the thing that wins the game, then any other things that might involve the environment that aren't about decarbonization, like, then those don't get really added up into any sort of triple jump move. You're not really getting score points for actually fixing other parts of the problem. It's just like, this is the nature of the game, is decarbonization at this point. So everything feeds into that.
Yeah.
And I know Leo's actually done quite a bit of, he's been looking into that specific case study about regenerative stuff and decarbonization, like within the ag space a little bit. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is how they're doing a lot of the. It was kind of just last night I was seeing it, but for a lot of like watersheds, so a big focus is on nutrient runoff into rivers, and in Vermont, like into Lake Champlain is the big issue. There's a lot of excess like phosphorus and nitrogen. So in quite a few states, they have these like nutrient credit systems where you essentially get a permit proving that you've gone through the necessary compliance to decrease the amount of the excess nutrient that would get into the watershed, and then be able to like redeem that credit for money or trade it in similar to a carbon trading system. And that sort of thing has been happening in quite a few states since like 2010s or so. But I mean, there's a lot to talk about with all of that.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't mean to put you on the spot for.
No, it's okay. I mean, I think earlier when we were talking about the prediction stuff, because I've been like researching more into Oak Ridge and whatnot, and they had the first computer in the South, like of the United States, was at Oak Ridge in the 50s, and it's just how they would do for the ecological subunit that was branched off of the health physics department. It's all, they would create simulations using the computer and then see if their field studies match those simulations, and then readjust the computer, and then just keep doing that. I mean, then that's pretty much the same paradigm that you're in with AI and all this other stuff. It's the same principle. So prediction is like really at the core of all of this, all of the Web3 and the digital paradigm and impact finance. Because if you can't predict, if you can't create a model, you can't do any of the things that you say you're going to do about making an impact. Because if you don't have like a model of what would happen if you don't do something, then you can't say, you can't have the offset if you don't make a model. So that principles in environmental impact projects, like human education, social services, it's all
population health, labor output, all of that. Yeah, it's all based in modeling, which is, I mean, amazing to me, because I remember like in doing my early research in ed tech and like having things run back to Los Alamos and Argonne and thinking, I didn't have any structure to understand what that meant, other than this seems disturbing. Like, why are test scores ending up in supercomputing centers? Like, this is odd. And yet, once you actually see the trajectory and the history and the structure, it's actually very, very logical that that's where the models would go. Only
they started it. They're the first ones to do it.
Enrolled in school, like they would have no clue that like there would be someone, like some system that's making a prediction market on the labor, the predicted economic value of the cohort of kids in a particular school district. I mean, it's not told to you like that. They just talk about like test scores or closing gaps or doing things, and no one ever like puts it forward to how it fits into the financial models.
Yeah.
And then increasingly how those models then justify increased surveillance, because like then we would have people who would fight surveillance in schools in terms of like video cameras in the halls, but not realizing that, like, yes, this device here that we're using, these Chromebooks, are actually also surveillance devices, right? Like, your method of educational delivery is in and of itself a surveillance device, with increasing like emotional recognition potential. So like they were fighting certain things about surveillance without actually really understanding. They were like a fish in water that doesn't see the water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, next clip.
And even just recording tests is kind of like surveillance. Having tests is just your record, your transcript.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I keep coming back at it. It's like we're giving everyone all these details, and then there's a basic fundamental understanding about the world that needs to be like examined critically. I don't know, like the idea, the question of like, do we need to be measuring everything? Do we need a ledger for everything? Like at what point does that serve us, and at what point does it cease to serve us? So I don't know. There's a lot of questions that just don't even think about all these, you know, there are like thousands and thousands of these talks from different conferences that are going on that are really insular amongst people that are building the thing. But in the general public, people have no idea about any of this stuff. They think crypto, you know, they Bitcoin, should I invest or should I invest in, I heard it went down. Like they have no clue. They have absolutely no clue what this thing is. And it's literally a new form of governance that's going to have a deep effect on every aspect of their life if this thing goes forward. You know, and yet there's no
within like the spaces that identify like, you know, whatever red pill people, or like I feel like I've, you know these things. Even within those spaces, Jason, like I'm still continue to be sort of shocked that there's such a small group of people speaking, like interrogating the other aspects of Web3 in the way that we are. It's just, it's not the norm. It's not the norm in any of these spaces. And the fact that so much of it has been pulled into some sort of blockchain, whether blockchain media or crypto, or, I mean, it just feels like kind of like a total setup, you know, and in all of these early encounters I had with people saying like, no, blockchain is about putting toddlers on, you know, in a ledger for social, like to manage their human capital, not coins. And, you know, you've been with me early on, like people couldn't get that through their mind that like, no, if you come in the door where they're putting children to manage their human capital, it's never going to be okay. Like this is never going to be our tool. But I will just say, I read some of this in my thing yesterday, this finite and infinite games, and it actually does talk about within the finite game of education and attaining credentials and attaining accreditations, and all of which would be things stored in the ledger, that the more games you play to attain those credentials, the more you are continue to invest in the system and back the power behind that keeps that system in place.
Right.
Which is really interesting if you start to take that apart into micro credentials and like ongoing credentialing, is that the more they can pull you into the game and then occasionally give you a little payout that you won and you get the token, or you get the degree, or you get the certification, then it's kind of like that whole student loan conversation. Like, I don't want anyone to get off the hook because I didn't get off the hook. Like, you will back the enforcement mechanism of the structure because you have skin in the game and you feel like you're entitled to this little amount that you're holding on to really hard because you earned it. And very few people are willing just to like walk away from the game and go like, actually, this is a shitty game. Like,
right.
let's not do this at all. And I feel like it's strategic. I feel like that.
Well, it's like the inverse of like a casino. You go into a casino and you're like, I've lost all this money, and you keep gambling because you're like, you want to get it back, and you keep losing more. This is the opposite. You're like, I've already gained all this stuff. I don't want to lose it, you know.
Well, and the other thing is like, if you've become like, what I've found is that it seems like the people who seem to be more receptive to understanding like what this actually is are people who have followed like non-traditional educational paths, who are like self-motivated around their own education, but are not necessarily credentialed. Like in some ways, I feel like I'm a bit of an aberration as somebody with like a graduate degree. I mean, in a relatively useless field of like, cultural landscape preservation, but like maybe that's why. But for the most part, once you have some sort of expertise on the books, like you don't actually want to admit you don't know the stuff, or you don't want to learn the stuff because you think, oh, somehow if I assume that I can learn this stuff too, it devalues the field of expertise broadly, right? Like if I believe that I can wade in and learn enough about Web3 to have an opinion, a solid informed opinion about it, I'm somebody with expertise and I like my prestige in my selected field. I don't want to weigh in on the experts over in that and what the Web3 space, because if I diminish their ability to say what's what, actually I'm diminishing my own ability in my own field. Like I'm just diminishing the idea of expertise, period. And I'm very invested in this idea of having expertise. So I'm not going to go tromp around anybody else's backyard, because ultimately in doing that, I'm hurting myself in the game that we are currently playing. And I think that that's interesting, because I mean, that may help understand like why even people that I would imagine like on the left or care about social justice causes are unwilling to engage in this, what's clearly a really obvious problem that is not embedded in political ideology, but they just don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
There's tons of important technologies or things that have been conceived that sit in scientific papers. Though we have an abundance of great results, but the bottleneck is in between science and technology building. That's the key part. And it's scaling that is going to let us cure more diseases faster, and so on. Now, Bell Labs is a huge inspiration to a lot of us in our network. It was an amazing hive of invention. It was responsible for so many of the technologies that we now take for granted, and they understood the translation process extremely well. The way they modeled it was as a full R&D pipeline, starting with research with small groups, but where the bulk of the work happened was afterwards, in what they called fundamental development, productionization, production, application development, and then later on, operating the business. Although most of the academic credit happened on the important discoveries like the laser and the transistor and the solar cells and so on, and usually most of the attention went to the few people that kind of had that conceptual breakthrough, the vast majority of Bell Labs' work sat downstream of that moment. They understood that innovation actually happened later. They described innovation as actually getting a conceptual result into being developed into proofs of concept, into devices, being put into a product that was delivered to the market. And they said that if you hadn't sold something at massive scale, you had not yet innovated. One other important piece here is that it is not a linear thing where one project turns into scale. In reality, one single idea will yield many possible paths, many different projects, many approaches, and of those, only one of them often will end up working out. From there, you try to productionize in a variety of ways, and only one of those will tend to work, or a few. And then once you have many attempts, there will usually be something like 5 to 20 startups working around the same idea, and eventually 1 or 2 will win. So this is a pretty large pipeline that involves tens to hundreds of teams working on the same idea across a 10 to 15 year time span. So when you think about large-scale R&D, what the world will benefit from is a large open network that enables as many groups as possible to give it a shot. What we benefit from is going from ideas to production as fast as we can. And the current IP structures, the current ways in which groups and companies tend to operate, they tend to try and hold back other groups from trying the same thing. And that's a mistake. What we want as a group is we all benefit, game theoretically, from speeding up the pipeline. So we should be thinking about new structures and new ways of accelerating this. New forms of IP that are more open source amenable. New funding structures that can come into the pipeline here.
It's interesting that Bell Lab, you saw that a hive of innovation, because I going to the Holmdel campus too, like seeing Bell Labs, like walking around in the crazy craft fair in the lobby, right? It's like the surreal with the Tarot booth, right? And, and that's part of that Severance TV show, was filmed in the Bell Labs Holmdel building. And that had the Severance is like the brain chip thing that they're talking about, that we were talking about in the first clip, is like having, like in the TV show, they show this Sorry, I may have to go to the kitchen. The street people.
It's not bad. We're good.
Yeah, I
They
can't
keep-
hear it.
Okay, you can't hear it. All right, it's a little distracting for me, but anyway, the whole thing with the brain chip, like, and it's like they literally take the woman to just an office, you know, so it's not a big surgical theater. It's kind of like what they're talking about. Oh, we just want to put a little chip right under, not really in the brain, just there. So anyway, that's just context. But for me, I think my takeaway and why I chose that section of the clip was this idea that they want as much actionable product as possible. Like, enough with this waiting since the 1990s or 80s and your zero knowledge proof stuff that didn't really go anywhere. We want this stuff changing the world now. And that was kind of the imperative that goes back to Huxley and UNESCO. He's like, humans are the sole trustee of evolution, and we want the maximum amount in the shortest time. And to me, that's what this feels like. And the current finance doesn't work for that. Like, and so when he's talking about the finance system and that initially different companies would compete against one another and withhold information that might make the advancements go faster, if they can reposition all of these emerging technologies as digital public goods, then they're going to create new finance structures for cooperation and non-rivalrous efforts. Because ultimately the end game, yeah, sure, it's to make money. Yeah. But I mean, ultimately the people who are going to make the money are the people who already have the money, like, which right now are the same people who are the VCs anyway. Like, they've all decided, like, the new way we're going to do it is we're just going to, like, get together and Andreessen Horowitz or, Larry Page or whatever, like, we're just going to kind of figure it out amongst ourselves. But the big game is to push this next phase of evolution quickly. And so I feel like reframing all of this emerging tech as a public good and coming up with this back end, like hyper search kind of stuff, they can play fast and loose with the money. They'll still make money, but they'll get their outcome faster. I don't know. Like, did you guys?
And, yeah, they can get as, like, this Web3, what they talk about is about making it open for any person with a bright idea to access and exploit that idea to make a new product or whatnot. And so I think what he's saying there is that they're trying to get as many people as possible with the, like you said, these new financial structures with the fast money, but to get people to build these things as quickly in a way that couldn't be done when you're all in the old world of competing businesses or whatnot. This way you can get people around the world trying different things at the same time and then having that coagulate in different ways. But the main thing, getting, like, as much people and their information to them as possible to build all these, basically the prison planet.
One, I would just say too, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the open sourcing, like the standards, that the global standards and the framing as open source. And, this idea of assigning credit, like somehow like intellectual patenting, like micro patenting, that like you could be like a refugee in a camp in Sudan and be a super bright mathematical person with a tablet and contribute some tiny bit of something that gets used 5 years from now, but you've been tagged as like somebody who had a certain share in the idea. And with this promise that there's going to be some economic payout down the line. Now, whether or not that happens, that's the case, but I think that'll be the carrot. So if you can unlock the intellectual potential of people who otherwise wouldn't be part of the like global intellectual capital flow, people who, because of their rural location or their disconnectedness or whatever, and you can actually tap into that. Like, to me, once I start looking at the development impact bonds for girls in India and these different things, it's like, because you also, in the complex systems theory, want people who are thinking about the problem in all different kinds of ways, right? Like from all different kinds of worldviews, because like, hey, maybe a Western Enlightenment worldview is too rigid and materialistic. Maybe what you really need is a, Bangladeshi girl, to think about it in some way that's like counter opposite, and then you'll come up with the key to unlock it. And if you can create a networked structure that will, tell her a story that in participating, she's helping superpowers and she'll get credit, then everyone's going to want to play the game, right? It's going to be a global game to save the planet, right? And youth in particular are the ones being targeted. So, and just think about the whole thing with Derek Bros and the crypto gaming. Like, you can imagine if they can come up with some sort of gamified interface where, the kids in this Mexican village are doing something that adds to some level of code. I don't know, like, to me, it feels like that's where it's going, but they need a new story to tell about how it's going to be financed in a non-rivalrous way that more for everybody, right?
Yeah. Well, and also, it might not seem like a big deal, but I think it's a very big deal in terms of like the concept of making money. Because like no one actually makes money except for the people, the banks, or the people who create the coins. So they create the coins, and then we all compete for the coins. So like even that language of making money, if you do something and you get a token, or like now you get money for doing something, our language is, how much money I made. You didn't actually make that money. The money was made, and it was part of the game. It's like Monopoly money or whatever. And then we're just competing for that money that was already made. It seems like a minor thing, but it's actually a really important point, in terms of where power actually is. Because you think, you have power. It's like, no, the coins are made for a specific purpose, and then people can compete for them based on whatever criteria or rules or whatever they set up for us to compete for that. So even like, it seems stupid, but like the language around this is even like inaccurate in terms of what's actually happening. So, yeah. Anyway.
Well, it also feels very fast and loose. Like later, there's one with Vitalik Buterin talking about like project tokens and like, retroactively, I can just shoot you some project tokens because I like you and I like you. It's like Oprah, and you get some tokens and you get some tokens. And and there's not like, on the one hand, they talk about this, like the rest of us are governed by smart contracts. But if you're the token guy, you're just like, and more tokens. I like you. Like, here's some tokens. Right. And, it's ridiculous because it all is about the story. If you're the person telling the story, you can make it up so that the rules benefit you and everybody else has to like live under the contract layer.
Right. And whoever or whatever, even if it's like an AI DAO system, extra tokens can always be created to tip the scales or whatever. If the tokens people have, they're using them in ways that are, not acceptable or whatever, I don't know. There's a lot to go in there. In terms of translating it into the token space, it does become more complicated because there are a lot more layers to it than we've dealt with in the past from like an economic, view.
Yeah, trying to explain how the tokenized impact bonds work is the whole. Because they have like internal, like with IXO, when he was talking about earlier with these like crypto economic primitives, that's what he means is these sort of cybernetic tokenized financial contracts that automatically settle but involve things like internal prediction markets where the people buying into the bond bet like within the financial contract whether they think that certain metrics will be hit by the education program success or whatnot, and then the outcome of those internal prediction markets changing the financial.
I think I have to move to the kitchen, guys. Sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry.
So that's what, when he's talking about these sorts of novel financial mechanisms for funding public goods or like just development of ideas in general, it gets really complicated really quickly.
Yeah. I'm gonna mute her real quick. There we go. I don't know if you looked into this, but I've been curious about the how they retire the tokens. Have you delved too much into that? Because I mean, obviously, they can't just keep creating tokens and tokens. I mean, the tokens would be useless if they didn't eventually retire them. So have you looked into the mechanisms that are being proposed or that are being built into the systems for?
Yeah, for a lot of things, they get burned. They can get destroyed, but it really depends on
based on what criteria.
Like in the smart contracts for when different things happen, like in MakerDAO, for instance, the smart contracts are set up so if the debt that's backing the DAI stablecoin is insufficient for people that have DAI to redeem it, then the MKR token is automatically minted to cover that shortfall. But in reverse, the payments on the debt, like the interest on the collateral that's minting the DAI, is used to buy the MKR token and destroy it and burn it. So there's like things like that. They're usually the burning part's usually a part of the crypto economics. Like with Ethereum now, with a recent upgrade, they're now burning transaction fees, like a certain amount of transaction fees. So the amount of ether in existence is now decreasing, whereas before it was always increasing at a certain rate. But now it's going low over time. But it kind of depends on the project. For something like IXO and those sorts of bonds, I'm sure they would like kind of collapse themselves after the like term of the impact bond is over, once it mature, like the maturity of the bond essentially. Say it would be like a 3-year thing, and then if the metrics are hit for the 3rd year, then they get their payout, and then the token just doesn't, either gets destroyed automatically or just doesn't, it's irrelevant because it's the payout was only for those 3 years. It has no value.
And that's the other piece of it too, that like there's like so many, it's like a really, really complicated thing with lots and lots of different layers, because then there's the, you have the token, and then you're converting the token to other kinds of money, for the payout or whatever. And then, not even getting into all the exchanges between tokens that are going to, and there are companies that are already, doing that, like exchanges, and, knowing the history of currency exchange, like it's bad. It's really bad.
And they do things like with all the tokens, you use the token, like with how all the blockchain exchanges work, pretty much the like liquidity of the exchange comes from people locking up their token, and then they earn the trading fees from the exchange. So, but they get a token, like when they lock up their token, they get a token that is the representation of the token that's locked up in there, plus their trading. So that, like, it gets really crazy. And, there's all sorts of craziness.
Okay. So, excuse me. New finance structure. Did we do that one? We did that one.
Yeah. So Dalrymple, the hypercerts.
Now your buddy, David.
And this guy, he's getting money from the private funds of Peter Thiel and Larry Page. Like, that's like on his bio. He's like, oh yeah, I get their private money. Right? So,
wow.
Yeah.
Another taxonomy I want to mention is timing. So prospective funding, of course, happens before good is produced. There you have an actual causal impact, but you have the uncertainty of whether the team is going to succeed, the uncertainty of whether the project is even possible, how much value it will be. And there's an information asymmetry there. The team that you're funding has more information than you do, so there's a market for lemons kind of situation. On the other hand, retrospective funding, much easier to evaluate something once it exists. But on the other hand, there's no causal impact. But on the other other hand, if you announce that you're going to be doing retroactive funding later, people might bet on that. Bountied funding is where you announce in a formal way that you're going to do retroactive funding for a particular thing. So that kind of helps eliminate the uncertainty on both sides. You know, as a project, that the funder is going to value something, and the funder knows that they're not going to have to pay unless and until there's a success that meets the conditions. But disadvantage is you have to think about what sorts of things you want to see happen and accurately articulate what the success conditions are and accurately assess how much you'd be willing to pay for it. You have to do that all in advance as a funder or as a funding intermediary. So it's important to have a structure to route some of the after the fact rewards back to people who funded things prospectively with the complete uncertainty. It's important to retain the option to give completely no strings attached grants. That's an important part of the funding ecosystem, especially when it comes to sort of regulated nonprofit structures who sometimes can't receive too much in return for their funding. But it's in order to extend the scope of what we can fund, we want a way for the prospective funders to obtain the rights to some of their retroactive funding. So some of the types of things that the funder might be able to get in return could be nothing, no strings attached, could be just bragging rights. And that's sort of the way that the NFTs for science movement is going, is what you're buying is a tokenized certificate that you were the one who funded this or funded a certain fraction of it, but you don't get anything more than that. You could be getting a right to retrospective rewards, and that's sort of where certificates of impact come in. You buy the certificate of impact, and then other assessors come around and say, okay, was this impact good? Okay, yes, I'm going to pay rewards. And who am I going to pay them to? All the people who are holding the certificates for that impact. And in the transferable case, we can also separate these sort of altruistic retrospective rewards where assessors come around and pay in exchange for nothing, just saying like, all right, good work. Here's your retrospective funding to pay back your financing costs. Reputational rewards where someone else wants to buy the bragging rights from you. For example, in that kind of ratchet auction situation that the last speaker mentioned, or toll-driven retrospective rewards. And this is often the case with VC funding where you're actually saying, okay, I want a share of your profit stream if you're going to then create a public good that you assess a toll for.
All right.
So it's interesting to me to look at that. And you saw at the end, it says like, let many flowers bloom. Like that was, I think that's sort of a big takeaway too, is that at this phase, they want to keep all their funding options open. And some of the stuff that he was talking about, like you might just want to give a grant, is sort of collapsing the phases into one another. So like, whereas in the past 10 or 15 years, you've had catalytic capital, which would be the philanthropies putting out money for seed grants to get things started that wouldn't actually happen in the marketplace until the market gets under it. And there's a VC that would sort of back the system. Like I've seen that so much in Pay for Success, that there's the catalytic sacrificial capital, and that's happening through like the philanthropy, and you have to disperse, I don't know, it was like, is it 5%? Like the IRS requires them to do 3 to 5% of their income every year as grants. But instead of doing them sequentially, now they can do them all at once, right? Like you can package a deal with some grant money, some upfront VC money, some retrospective VC money. And you can imagine that most of the people operating in the space probably have access to various pots of kinds of money, right? Like these people have their money spread all over the place so that they can start to sort of craft the best deal product for the thing they want for these thousands of flowers to bloom, right? And to me, that feels like it's the speeding up process. I don't know, does that? And a lot of that sounds like Pay for Success, right? They're like, oh, we will retroactively fund you if it meets the outcome metric that was specified. That's an outcomes-based contract.
When thinking about risk, it's like the VC, I don't know, I'm just thinking about how that affects like VC capital and risk. It seems like there's it reduces the risk involved in venture capital funding. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? which I mean, the whole point of venture capital funding is you're going to take a big risk with the possibility of having a big reward here. It's like a transference of risk from the VC capital. And maybe am I you guys tell me if,
but I think the new model is public good. So the new model isn't that you're going to make a bunch of money on the product. It's going to be the data stream.
Right. Yeah.
But you have to put in the guts of the system.
But it's both. I mean, it's there are two things going on at the same time. Yeah.
But I think they're transitioning. I think what they're saying is the emerging tech, like they are seeking to shift the emerging tech finance model into a new phase, which looks different.
Yeah, for sure. But there's still that investment piece is still in there. Like, right? I mean,
well, I guess it depends on like what is people. There's not an office. People aren't going to an office anymore. Right? What is your investment? Like, what is your infrastructure? It's intellectual capital, so it's people's time. A lot of these are probably young people, like who have been told that they have no job security. Like, it's a gig work, so it's not like there's high levels of salaries in the coding. I mean, like, I don't know, like, look at the people that with all these videos, like, are these people, like, sure, a few people are probably pulling in nice salaries, but a lot of people are probably not planning on a lot of stability. Like these, I would assume, like you look at the LinkedIns, these people have jobs for just like, I did a couple years here and 9 months there. And but like, it's just all over the place. So to me, like, what are their upfront costs to develop the tech? Like, it's different when they're building it out and you actually need a factory to fabricate something. But if it's intellectual capital, that's pretty low cost. If you can get people to play the game with the intention of like, oh, it's on future credit. If the thing you do becomes important, we'll give you the reputation certificate that you can then exchange. And maybe if you're 24, you're willing to put in 2 years of your life on the risk that like maybe the thing you do will have a big payoff later. And that's the prediction market. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think, Leo? Like, are you?
No, I mean I think both what you're both saying is true, or I guess I'm like, I'm a little unclear on like how this is playing out. It seems like there's a blending. I mean, I think like what you're saying about the nature of risk changing, I think there's a lot there. It's different because they're transitioning into this new system, and the whole, it's like that is the new basis of risk, is like how things play out or interact in like the metaverse, for the digital world, for lack of a better word. So it's not, and then all of the notions of success and profit look really different, because it's more like, it's not just a company that makes a new invention that turns into a product that they sell for a bunch of money. It's more like projects making a type of software or little layer in a larger like stack of software that makes some sort of, brings in lots of data streams or has other sorts of repercussions and other spheres of the digital economics. So it's like I don't know. I think we don't really know exactly how this is. It's different. It's definitely different in the profit.
It's going to be but I can't, like, look when we went down and we saw where Palantir was in Denver, right? Like, it wasn't that Palantir came to Denver and built a big giant corporate campus. Like, they didn't do that. Like, it wasn't like the old, like a Google, like, I'm going to go build a giant campus and bring all my people here. Right. It's a new kind of pivotal model. So the nature of the investment, I think, is just different. But it's the legacy stuff is still going to be there. Like, it's not, those campuses aren't going to shutter up anytime soon.
Yeah. When I was thinking of it, I think more in terms of impact finance sort of approach too. So.
But that's the other stream, right? Is if what you say is like, we're, Andreessen is maybe investing in scattering money around a bunch of refugee camps and whatever, like, college to career pathway places and community colleges, and giving, and then some other more targeted things like Many Flowers Bloom, but then also investing in deals that are training those people as they get their competencies. Like, you're investing in the people who are also, it's like double dipping, like you layer it in. You're like, okay, I'm going to invest in you to give me some intellectual capital, but I'm also going to use you as an impact commodity for the deal I'm doing on the side, which is, college and career readiness. And, because we've even seen in that, whatever, learning is earning, like on the ledger, like this high school girl is like, oh, look, I'm totally doing protein folding puzzles. And like, I'm a scientist and I'm a student and it's also my job, right? Like, it's my first job. I'm the scientist doing protein folding. Like, so you can see how this new weird model is going to be like, oh yeah, you're 3 things in one. Like and I'm sure they're going to try to profit off of all of them,
Yeah.
But we can't get, like, even we can't get our minds around it. And we're probably some of the most informed people out there at this stage.
Yeah, it definitely takes some rewiring in your own head about like how you think about things. Cause I always like someone tells me that they're an economist or they've studied economics. I'm just like, oh, okay, here we go. How do I explain this to you? Because it's like, oh, you've got to unlearn all this other stuff. A lot of the stuff you were taught.
I mean, I guess with impact finance in general, the notion of, I mean, I guess in some ways it doesn't matter because they just change the rules as they go. But like theoretically, it seems like the idea of risk in that world would be whether it's all about whether the metrics are hit or not, and then that's determines whether you get your capital and the interest back or not.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
but the thing is like I was even finding some things like quite early on, like out of George Overholzer, who is with Third Sector and the Nonprofit Finance Fund and Capital One, where like they were selling insurance products on deals that would fall through, right? And so like they were already like providing this like hammock, like, okay, that deal falls through, but you've got the insurance policy that will still pay you even if it falls through. So yeah, they can change the rules.
Kind of the basis of hedge funds.
Yeah.
It's because it's all about hedging your bets and having insurance for the thing that you already own, and yeah.
And then there's reinsurance, which is insurance companies insuring themselves for the insurance which they're insuring other people for. You have to look at like the whole picture in order to see, because there's so many different, I mean, it's like this thing affects this thing. And there was like, and that's the problem is we have this thinking and we're like, you're like, I'm going to study this one thing. And I'm like, if you're not going to understand shit if you're just studying that one thing, because there's all these connections that affect one another. So it takes a little bit of work to process all this.